Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Day 2 of the Iran Conference. Please join me in welcoming NUFDI's Vice President, Kamran Khansarinia.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for being back with us on Day 2. Those of you with us in the room and those of you watching live on X, on YouTube, on Persian language broadcasts inside the country, خوش اومده ویژه به همیهنمون در داخل مملکت. We're honored to have you back with us today for another round of exciting panels from some of Washington's most preeminent, erudite experts on Iran from across the political spectrum, and we're extremely honored, as I said yesterday, to have each of these individuals share their time with us voluntarily. And as I noted yesterday, each and every one of our speakers who comes to these events and honors us with their presence and their knowledge does so without receiving any remuneration. So we're extremely thankful for their time and their knowledge that they'll be offering us. Before we go into one or two brief remarks before our first panel, I want to extend a special thanks on behalf of the entire NUFDI staff and the organization to the chairman of our board of directors, Mr. Shahpar Razmzan, who has been with us throughout this entire conference, and whose dedicated volunteer leadership makes so much of what NUFDI does possible. So we're thankful, sir, that you're here with us, and we look forward to many more conferences with you. Without further ado, there is somebody far more interesting and far more valuable to hear from than me, so I'll give the podium over to her. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Afsoon Najafi, Iranian activist and sister of slain protester Hadis Najafi.
درود عزیزان، ببخشید من یکم صدام گرفته، شاید اذیت بشین، خواستم قبلش عذرخواهی بکنم. سلام و درود بر شما حضار گرامی. با کمال تشکر از نوفدی که دعوت کردن من اینجا باشم و درود به شاهزاده که در کنار ما هستن. افسون نجفی هستم، خواهر زنده‌یاد حدیث نجفی، دختری که سمبل آزادی و شجاعت شد. امروز در اینجا جمع شده ایم تا درباره خواهرم حدیث نجفی صحبت کنیم که نامش برای همیشه در تاریخ ایران جاودان خواهد ماند. حدیث نجفی جوانی که با شجاعت و اراده قوی به نمادی از مقاومت و مبارزه در راه آزادی تبدیل شد. در جریان اعتراضات سال 1401 در ایران با گلوله جنگی کشته شد. او در 30 شهریور روزهای تاریک و سختی که جامعه ایرانی برای دستیابی به آزادی‌های فردی و اجتماعی می‌جنگید به خیابان‌ها آمد و با دلیری در برابر ظلم ایستاد. اینکه حدیث بدون هیچ سلاحی تنها با حضور در میدان مبارزه به مقابله با ستم و سرکوب رفت، نشان از اراده بی‌نظیر و روح بلند او دارد. حدیث همچون بسیاری از جوانان سرزمینم معتقد بود که برای رسیدن به آینده‌ای روشن و عدالت باید هزینه داد و برای حق آزادی باید ایستادگی کرد. نام حدیث نجفی تنها یک نام نیست، بلکه نمایانگر تمامی جوانان و مردمانی است که برای آرمان‌های خود، برای آینده‌ای بهتر حاضرن از جان و مال خود بگذرند. او با حرکت‌های شجاعانه خود چراغی از امید و مقاومت را برای نسل‌های آینده روشن کرد و نشان داد که آزادی و عدالت هدف‌هایی است که با آسانی به دست نمی‌آیند و نیازمند فداکاری‌های بسیار هستند. حدیث نمادی از همبستگی مقاومت جمعی شد. او نماینده نسلی است که با وجود تمام فشارها و سرکوب‌ها همچنان به آینده‌ای بهتر ایمان دارند و برای آن می‌جنگند. درسی که از زندگی و مبارزه حدیث می‌گیریم این است که آزادی و عدالت هیچگاه رایگان به دست نمی‌آید. باید برای آن تلاش و ایستادگی کرد و گاه از بزرگترین سرمایه خود یعنی جان گذشت. امروز من خواهر یکی از قربانیان حکومت دیکتاتوری اینجا هستم تا به عنوان دادخواهی که تا آخرین نفس می‌جنگم تا آزادی را به دست بیاوریم از جامعه جهانی خواستار اعمال فشارهای دیپلماتیک باشم. به عنوان نماینده خانواده‌های دادخواه خواستار فشارهایی از طریق دیپلماسی و سیاسی بر حکومت جمهوری اسلامی هستم تا مانع خشونت و قتل و سرکوب شوند. ما خانواده‌های دادخواه و تمام قربانیان خواستار اعمال تحریم‌های مشخص علیه مقامات حکومتی و نیروهای دخیل در سرکوب و نقض حقوق بشری هستیم. همانطور که جمهوری اسلامی بعد قربانی کردن ما خانواده‌ها را محدود در هر چیزی می‌کنند، جلوگیری از مراسم و مناسبت‌های عزیزانمان، کنترل و تهدید، جلوگیری از آزادی بیان، زندانی کردن، عدم وجود امنیت جانی و حتی مالی، مسدود کردن حساب‌های بانکی ما، توقیف اموال شخصی خانواده‌ها، پرونده سازی برای به زانو درآوردن. خانواده‌ها هم خواستار محدودیت‌های مسافرتی و توقیف اموال این افراد هستند. ما از سازمان ملل و نهادهای حقوق بشری می‌خواهیم که تحقیقات مستقلی درباره سرکوب‌ها و کشتارها انجام دهند و نتایج آنها را عمومی کنند. خواستار قطع یا محدود کردن روابط دیپلماتیک و اقتصادی از کشورهای خارجی هستیم، به ویژه در زمینه‌هایی که به سرکوب مردم کمک می‌کنند. ما قربانیان انتظار داریم که دولت‌های خارجی و نهادهای بین‌المللی به جای سکوت از اعتراض مردم ایران حمایت کنند و صدای آنها در مجامع جهانی منعکس کنند. از طریق رسانه‌های خارجی، شبکه‌ها، تریبون‌ها که قربانیان بتوانند صدایی باشند تا این جنایت سالیانه به گوش تک تک انسان‌های آزادیخواه برسد، تا کمکی به برقراری عدالت و پایان دیکتاتوری باشد. مبارزه ما هیچگاه بی‌ثمر نخواهد بود. مبارزه مردم ایران تا روز آزادی ادامه خواهد داشت. زمان آن فرا رسیده که در کنار ما باشید. برای کمتر شدن قربانیان، برای جلوگیری از کشتار، برای سرعت بخشیدن به آزادی ایران. به امید ایرانی آزاد و آباد. مرسی.
We now have a message from Congressman Joe Wilson, Chairman of the Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee on the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
I'm Joe Wilson, a member of the U.S. Congress who is Chairman of the Middle East Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee. It is my honor to address the esteemed National Union for Democracy in Iran conference. Iranian Americans in South Carolina and across America play such a positive role in continuing to advocate for a democratic and free Iran. We are in a conflict we did not choose, of dictators with rule of gun invading democracies with rule of law. The people of Iran do not want war. The regime sadly demands it. The regime in Tehran has been committed to heinous acts of torture and murder against its own citizens who simply demand dignity and the basic human freedoms. The people of Iran deserve a government which respects their rights and self-determination. As chairman of the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I remain committed to holding to the regime the accountability for its crimes against the brave people of Iran. I was grateful to extend to the Maximum Pressure Act and the Regime Act to impose severe costs on the regime, but that has not been enough. We must also have maximum support for the people of Iran who courageously put their lives on the line to pursuit of freedom and dignity. God bless you and thank you for your very courageous and meaningful work.
Our first panel of today is the ticking time bomb, Khamenei's nuclear ambitions, which will discuss Tehran's nuclear ambitions, recent progress, and the potential consequences of a nuclear-armed Iran. Joining us for this panel are Michael Singh, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, Behnam Taleblu, Senior Fellow at FDD, and Matthew Kronig, Vice President and Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center. Moderating this panel is Afshineh Latifi, an attorney and member of the NUFDI Advisory Council. Please welcome our speakers.
Good morning to everyone. Good morning, distinguished panel. Thank you, all of you, for being here. And as you know, our discussion today is the ticking time bomb, Khamenei's nuclear ambitions. At the outset, I wanted to say that, Mike, I understand you may have to leave a little bit earlier, so we are going to get all of our important questions to you out early so we can get your insight into everything. I want to start out with Behnam, though. Behnam, you and your colleagues at the FDD have recently published a monograph entitled Deterring Iran's Dash to the Bomb, where in addition to laying out a series of steps that the regime could take that would make its program even more dangerous before actually developing a nuclear weapon, you discuss about the successful past deterrent acts we've taken, as well as lessons the U.S. would need to heed if it wants to successfully deter Iran in the future. Can you share some of those lessons with us?
Absolutely, and I'll try to be brief because I know this is an area that both Mike and Matt have looked at as well. But thank you for the question, and thank you to NUFDI for the invitation and for doing everything that you do to keep Iranian Americans in the fight. It's appreciated very much, not just in this town, but across this country, so thank you. To a slightly more technical question, the Islamic Republic has only backed down a handful of times in its history. The problem is we can all count them on one hand, probably. The ending the Iran-Iraq war or agreeing to the JCPOA nuclear deal. There's a whole host of tactical things that we've done in the region to get them to back down, but one tool of success is actually calling it out as you see it. You know, just like the rule of the New York City subway, if you see something, say something. It's called deterrence by detection. You basically put a spotlight on some kind of activity that the Iranians think is secret or is illicit, and by merely calling it out, you can thwart it, you can generate more pressure, you can develop sunk costs for it, and 9 times out of 10, the Iranians will think they have a safe pathway. Once they come up and meet the limelight, they'll have to go down and find a new way to innovate. And the reason I say they'll have to find a new way to innovate is that this is a regime that has had, unfortunately, a relatively consistent foreign and security policy for the past 45 years. The quest for the ultimate weapon is not a science fair program. It's a quest, really, for the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism to get a nuclear weapon. And that's why the other element that has worked time and time again is strength, and more importantly, consistent strength. Only when faced with the option of there being no way out but through can you get to a situation that you had at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, where for the purpose of regime survival, for the purpose of expediency, and we can debate the utility of even offering these guys regime survival at a certain point, but only then will they ever take the knee and, in their own parlance, drink from the poison chalice or drink from the cup of poison. So if there is a new administration looking for a new kind of art of the deal, if you will, I think the idea of nuclear diplomacy with the Islamic Republic really should be pushed away. But if this is still going to come back to the front burner, the idea of pushing on these guys from a position of strength and continuing that strength. And again, because we mentioned the Iran-Iraq war, small historical anecdote many have missed in this town, is that 3 times during the end of the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, you had Iranian officials say that the 1.5 years of unilateral economic sanctions was more damaging to them than the 8-year Iran-Iraq war. One time President Rouhani said it, at least 2 to 3 times Iran's then oil minister, Mr. Zangin, has said it. So even though in this town, for some reason, that policy is treated with a stigma, we should be, not putting words in the mouths of Iranians and looking to see what they fear and amplifying those fears. But I have to tell you, so long as this regime is in power, I think it's going to be pursuing this ultimate weapon.
Okay. Mike, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, let me first say it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. I always find it funny when I'm described as an Iran expert, as Cameron did. I've never been to Iran. you guys are the Iran experts, and it's a real pleasure to have a chance to sit here with you. I think that those of us who work on Iran policy, it's tremendously benefited from the engagement of the Iranian American community, because we need to learn from you, frankly. Look, Behnam's answer was correct, and I think that when we talk about Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon, it's important that we understand that for this regime, they're pursuing nuclear weapons not as some sort of lark, but because it makes sense as part of their national security strategy. I don't say it makes sense in an approving way, but look at what's happening in the region right now. Iran tried to strike Israel in mid-April using a conventional strike, about 300 drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and so forth. It was completely ineffective. It was humiliating, in fact, because not only did they not succeed in significantly damaging their targets, but most of the projectiles didn't get through because a coalition of the United States and other countries in the region stood together against Iran. And this is what Iran faces. It faces a coalition of countries which all stand against it, which all oppose this regime, and who are determined to counter its efforts in the region. That will only underscore for the regime that given that conventional weakness, given that they have no friends in the region, except for maybe Bashar al-Assad and some proxies, that will, I think, redouble their determination to get nuclear weapons because of the fear that they should have, frankly, of this coalition that's arrayed against them. And the idea that often underpins our diplomacy, I'm not against diplomacy, by the way, I want to say that from the outset. The idea that often underpins our diplomacy, I think, taken out of international relations classroom, and I don't say that as an insult to Matt, but is that somehow we can offer the regime through diplomacy, through negotiations, security assurances. Personally, I don't think there's anything we could possibly say to the Iranian regime that would make them feel secure in the face of all that they face against them in the Middle East. I don't think there's anything we could say in the context of negotiations that would make them feel as though, any American president, Republican or Democrat, is simply going to stand by and not do anything while they pursue the strategy they're pursuing in the Middle East. Therefore, they want nuclear weapons. The way, I think, to stop them, the way, I think, to get them to reconsider is to make them worry about the cost of pursuing nuclear weapons. And that's what Vietnam is talking about. The cost, yes, in terms of reputation, but the cost directly. To make them worry that, in fact, the cost will be so high that they won't succeed to get nuclear weapons. Because either we'll impose damaging sanctions, or we might even intervene militarily to stop them. I don't think the regime right now is convinced that that's the case. And to me, that's a real problem, and that's why you see them pushing forward so vigorously with their nuclear program.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, Behnam, I understand that Iran has enriched uranium up to 60%, if possibly not more. And the IAEA has reported that Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium is now more than 18 times the limit set by the JCPOA. How does this level of enrichment impact the timeline that for Iran developing a nuclear weapon? And what can the international community, what should the response be from the international community, especially now with the United States being so focused on its own elections and Israel involved with Hezbollah and Gaza and having their hands tied? What do you think the international community, how should they react to that?
Well, I'll also try to be brief because this would be another great point to have Mike and Matt on as well. But listen, the Islamic Republic has not just gone to 60%, which is something they've threatened to do a decade ago, but only felt comfortable doing in April 2021. Ironically, that was the same month that the Biden administration began its indirect nuclear diplomacy via the Russians in Vienna with the Islamic Republic to resurrect the nuclear deal. Khamenei had talked about nuclear propulsion for nuclear-powered submarines that they don't even have back in 2011, 2012, if you remember. But even last February, they went to 83, 84% purity briefly. They didn't stockpile it, but they went just a razor's edge away from pure weapons-grade uranium. And you don't even need pure weapons-grade uranium to drop a nuclear weapon. By the way, the US, the only country in the world that has actually used nuclear weapons, dropped 2 in the end of World War II in Japan, 1 uranium, 1 plutonium. The US didn't even test the uranium uranium version, and the uranium that it did drop was reportedly enriched to only 80% purity. So newsflash, the Islamic Republic has gone to 83, 84% last February and come back down. It's a huge problem. The growing stockpile, the more centrifuges, all this diminishes the breakout timeline. The problem is if you have the philosophical preset that the current administration has, which is at best to manage the problem, you all know the military saying the problem ends up managing you. It ends up constraining and limiting the Biden administration's approach, and you get this fundamentally reactive posture. So I think step number one is you have to play offense and put the Iranians on defense. I do think snapback can be the beginning of a much larger conversation. I think snapback would have been ideal when the Iranians went to 60%. It definitely would have been ideal when they went to 83%. But getting a broad baseline diplomatic pressure policy in place that from there allows you to respond to the next Iranian steps in concert with your European partners, that needs to be step number one. And because there is no broad multilateral understanding as to what we have to do, I think we've all kind of been adrift. The U.S., as you see at the IAEA in Vienna, has barely even been issuing these resolutions of censure. They haven't referred Iran's file to the Security Council. And by the way, this is a tool, if you're interested in avoiding war, or at least marshaling every bit of diplomatic and economic pressure before, God forbid, having to go to a conflict. This is a tool you want to exhaust, and the UN Security Council will be a tool we will no longer have against the Islamic Republic after October 2025, because Russia's quite keen on playing the role of Iran's lawyer there. And this is, again, a big worry, and it will confront whoever is president after January.
Thank you. Matt, did you want to add to that?
Well, first, I'd just say it's an honor to be here, and thank you very much for all you do and for organizing this important conference. And like Mike, I'm sometimes described as an Iran expert, but I've never been to Iran, but I have been working on U.S. policy toward Iran for more than 20 years now. And I'm kind of depressed because Iran, I've been working for 20 years to try to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, and now it's closer than it's ever been. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has said that Iran's dash time to producing 1 bomb's worth of fissile material is now down to 1 or 2 weeks. Some people try to console themselves and say, well, it would be additional time, maybe a year to actually build a bomb, additional time to put it on a missile. And that's true, but I think once they get 1 bomb's worth of fissile material, essentially the game's over, because they could move that material, put it in places where we couldn't reach it. And so I think once they get there, Iran becomes a nuclear power. And I think that's also depressing for what it means for the future of democracy and human rights in Iran. If the Islamic Republic is armed with nuclear weapons, I think it makes it much harder for the international community to affect developments in terms of regime in Iran. And also, I think, maybe helps the regime to hold on to power domestically. So I'm worried where we are. And I don't think we have a strategy right now. The United States and its allies, I don't think we have a strategy for stopping Iran from building nuclear weapons. The Biden administration came in with the idea that they were going to get back into the Iran nuclear deal, use that as a baseline to negotiate a longer, stronger deal. And that hasn't worked. Iran hasn't agreed to that. And there's really no plan B that I can see. I think the administration has essentially been hoping that this doesn't blow up before the election, and so I hope that a Harris administration or a Trump administration will put in place a serious plan to stop Iran's program. But I'm depressed.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, when you say Harris or Trump administration, and this is open to all 3 of you, do you guys feel like with the issue of nuclear weapons, will, depending on which administration comes to power in January, do you think it makes a difference, Harris or Trump?
Well, of course it's going to make a difference. You know, we'll see different policies from a Harris administration than we will from a Trump administration. But my worry is different from that. I sort of join Matt in being a little bit depressed about this issue, because I worry that we as a national security establishment have largely given up on this and moved to a sort of more containment-oriented mindset. Because at the end of the day, as I said, look, I think that if we're going to really stop the Iranian regime from obtaining nuclear weapons, they're going to have to worry a lot about what our response would be to their effort to get to that threshold that Matt talked about. But what do you hear in Washington these days? You hear basically Middle East fatigue, which is only going to be worse now after the last year's events. You hear worries that we don't, in fact, even have the capability, the munitions, the forces to take on more than one threat at a time, and the idea that we really need to prioritize the Indo-Pacific, Asia, which is not wrong from a strategic standpoint. But on the other hand, no real effort to do anything to address those deficiencies, to increase military spending, to put ourselves in a position where we could address threats in Europe, in the Middle East, in the Indo-Pacific at the same time. And if it comes down to a choice between needing to deter China and needing to deter Iran, I worry that the choice will be China. And at the end of the day, our willingness to intervene militarily, our willingness to pose a credible threat so that we don't ultimately need to either intervene or accept an Iranian nuclear weapon, I see very little willingness to do that on any side in Washington these days. I see instead a sort of a hope for silver bullets, whether that's a diplomatic silver bullet or a sanctioned silver bullet. But I don't see a real willingness to take this problem head on. I think it's a big mistake, not just a big mistake when it comes to nuclear proliferation or just security in the Middle East, but in terms of our global strategy. Because as I think you've had another panel discuss, I don't think we can separate the challenges of Iran, Russia, and China. Whether you want to call it an axis or whether you simply see them pursuing sort of mutual interests in a sort of marriage of convenience, as I look at that group arrayed against us, Iran is the weakest of those three and the most susceptible to pressure, and yet that's where I think we're least likely right now to be applying that pressure.
Okay, thank you. And so all three of you have touched on the issue of sanctions and whether they've been effective or they haven't been, and you know how Washington feels about it. But Iran has continued to make progress in its nuclear program. How effective do you guys think sanctions have been in curbing that, and what other measurements can we take in addition to sanctions?
Sure, I'll jump in here. And you asked about would Harris or Trump have a different approach? I think they would. And what I'd recommend to both of them is I do think that we should be clear about what the goal is. I think a good strategy starts with clear goals. And I think the goal should be to get Iran to give up its enrichment program altogether. And I think sometimes people don't understand this, but if Iran really wants a peaceful nuclear energy program, there's no need for it to have its own enrichment program. The vast majority of countries on Earth, Mexico, United Arab Emirates, Vietnam, others with peaceful nuclear programs, don't make their own fuel. They have the fuel provided to them by other countries. That's something we've offered to Iran for 20 years, and they've always refused. And so I think that's one piece of evidence that this isn't just a peaceful energy program, it is a bomb program. So I think we should insist on zero enrichment. And essentially have a pressure and engagement strategy, which is what Obama did, I think is what Trump did, and I think going back to something like that makes sense, and say if you're willing to come to the table, if you're willing to talk about giving up enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief, for help with getting nuclear fuel, we're willing to do that. But so long as you continue on this path, we're going to make life difficult with tougher sanctions. I agree with Mike. I think the military option needs to be on the table because I don't think the Islamic Republic wants a military conflict with the United States. And so if we have a credible military option on the table, I think that's something that would stop them from dashing to a bomb. And so to directly answer your question, then I think sanctions do play a role. They're not a silver bullet. They're not going to do it on their own. But I think that they need to be a component of a broader pressure and engagement strategy.
Mike, on your time constraints, are you okay? Or okay? Let me just hop in here with a footnote to what Matt just said. Listen, the challenge facing the next U.S. administration, you could read it in the tea leaves of the people that came before. Obama, very different than Trump, very different than Biden. But in essence, these three very different people from different political parties had one broad philosophical view that unfortunately exists to some degree in the grassroots, which is that the Middle East, since the Iraq War, since the engagements of the early part of the 2000s in the region, is a junk bond and you have to get out. And you've seen these three very different people engage with the region through that transactional less is more approach. And unfortunately, I believe should this approach continue into 2025 and into the next administration, it'll definitely water down not just the success of stopping a potential Iranian nuclear weapon, but it'll stop the success of what you guys were talking about all day yesterday, which is trying to push for a peaceful evolution inside that country and to have finally a political order in that country that represents the views, values, and interests of the Iranian people. And that is going to be majorly impeded by the U.S. trying to do less, not more there. And I think it's high time for us to connect the dots. I don't mean this in a disrespectful way to the scholarship of Matt or Mike, who really are masters of this on the counterproliferation side. But I think given how close the Islamic Republic is today, I think step number one, as Matt was just saying, getting your strategy, ways, means, and ends all properly aligned. I think goal number one actually has to be stop the regime. Stopping the bomb has to be a component of stopping the regime. Our problems with the Islamic Republic of Iran did not originate with the nuclear issue. They will not end with the nuclear issue. In fact, the whole world is telling you you have a whole other host of problems that are driving you in a very dangerous direction. And I think it's time we take stock of that. Lest we forget, even before there was a nuclear deal, right? The Europeans actually were to America's right on the nuclear issue. Before the JPOA, the 2013 interim deal, the European had about 420, this is before the UK left via Brexit, they had about 420 designations on Iran. The US Treasury had about 380, 390. And that was because Europe saw Iran developed 20%, Iran threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, and the crackdown on the Green Movement in 2009 following, and then 2010. You fast forward to today, you have all of these three vectors on steroids. It's not 20%, it's 60%. It's not the post-Green Movement crackdown, it's the post-Massa crackdown. And it's not threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz or Persian Gulf. It's now been exported to the Red Sea. And the cherry on the sundae is that they're tightening ties with America's great power competitors. Literally, Iranian weapons, Iranian drones are on 4 different continents today. Iran is basically backing Russia's war against Ukraine. It sees its interests more with America's great power adversaries than ever before. There is a new, I would use the word axis or partnership between Iran, Russia, China, potentially Syria, North Korea, depending on how you count. And our inability to see this coming is going to lead to major policy disasters that will not be quarantined to the nuclear issue. It could lead to a lot of other strategic surprises like 10-7s or Iranian weapons in jurisdictions we didn't think of. And especially if we're talking about defenses, conventional defenses to offset some of these things, we're going to be stretched to push back on Iranian weapons in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and even as we are today in Europe with the debate over arming Ukraine 2 years after Russia's war there. So I think step number one is actually, despite the nuclear issue being the area of convergence for us for so long, step number one now has to be, given how much foreign aggression there is, given how much domestic suppression there is, given how persistent of a threat this is on the terrorism front. You heard the panel yesterday. On the great power competition front, you have the literature of both these gentlemen in DC, the book, the monograph, the work at WINEP. It's time to connect the dots. Stopping the bomb has to be a component now of stopping the regime. That has to be priority number one. And in that, we need also clarity from Washington, but also to work more hand in hand with the diaspora and with the people of Iran. That has to be priority number one.
Thank you, Behnam. Mike, Iran's nuclear program has led to increased tensions with the neighboring countries. What are the implications of Iran's stockpile for regional security, especially as it pertains to Israel and Saudi Arabia? And how have these tensions affected the broader Middle Eastern geopolitical landscape?
Well, I think there have been severe consequences to Iran's ability to push forward so far on its nuclear weapons program, as well as its activities in the region, in places like Lebanon and Syria and Yemen. And I would point to 3 in particular. Number one, what have we seen from Iran's closest neighbors, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia? Well, first, we have seen a resumption of diplomatic ties between those countries and Iran. And I think that the countries that have done this, the Arab Gulf states that have done this, have done it in hopes that by having normal relations with Iran, by talking with the regime, they can somehow put a ceiling or a cap or a lid on conflict with Iran. And we saw this trend start, frankly, after some Iranian strikes in the region, after the outbreak of war in Yemen, and a feeling, I think, amongst our partners in the region that we, the United States, the West in general, was not going to intervene to help. And so they were essentially on their own. And so that was the first response. The second response we've seen, though, is on the other side. We've seen these states attempting to do things to bolster their own security, which is what we would expect to see them do. And that's taken a number of forms. Saudi Arabia is interested not just in a defense treaty with the United States, but also in its own nuclear program, including the complete fuel cycle on Saudi territory. And those have been advanced discussions now between the United States and Saudi Arabia in that regard. So we've seen them take steps like this. Obviously, they've done other things, such as trying to purchase new weapon systems and so forth. So we see both an effort to put a cap on conflict with Iran, as well as perhaps deter Iran through steps like that. But there's another trend we've seen, which a few scholars like Eric Brewer and others have written about, which I think is also very important. We worry, and many, I think all three of us have probably written about the idea that Iran could become more aggressive, feel greater impunity if it had nuclear weapons. But we actually see the regime already making use of its threshold status, its nuclear weapons threshold status, to act more aggressively and with more impunity in the region. So, you know, Iran will do something in Lebanon or against Israel and so forth, and as we in the West or as our partners in the region are contemplating a response or how to retaliate, the regime will explicitly threaten that any retaliation will bring a crossing of the nuclear weapons threshold, a crossing of the 90% enrichment threshold that Bethnam was talking about before. And so we see that even without nuclear weapons, Iran is sort of weaponizing, as it were, its status as a threshold state. This will only get worse as time goes on and as their nuclear capabilities advance and as their regional posture strengthens.
Thank you.
See, you're only clapping now out of sympathy because you clap for Bethnam, so I appreciate that.
Matt, this is for you. Despite past assessments from U.S. intelligence that the regime in Iran is, I quote, not currently undertaking the key nuclear weapons development activities that would be necessary to produce a testable nuclear device, there's an unclassified assessment that was sent to Congress this past July by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence that said since 2020, Iran has undertaken activities that better position it to produce a nuclear device if it chooses to do so. And yet we hear from the Iranian leaders that this is all peaceful. Is it really peaceful? And how can transparency be ensured to verify the peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear activities?
So I don't think this is a peaceful nuclear energy program. I think it's clearly designed to give Iran a nuclear weapon. And I think it was a mistake for the U.S. government to publicize that Iran has stopped its nuclear weapons activities. Not that it was wrong, but it was confusing. Because when it comes to building nuclear weapons, you essentially have to do three things. The first and most difficult part is producing the fuel, enriching uranium. And Iran has been enriching uranium and is, now has the most advanced enrichment program ever. Again, 1 to 2 weeks dash time. So that should have been the focus all along, the enrichment program. Second, you need the ability to weaponize and to turn it into a warhead. That's true. But that's maybe the easiest stage. The United States didn't even test its first nuclear weapon that it used on Hiroshima. The simple gun type design. It did test the more sophisticated implosion design. But we know that Iran has been working on that in the past. It had shaped charges and other things for an implosion design, so we know they've done work there. And you're right, recent evidence that maybe they've restarted that. And then third and finally, you need the ability to get the weapon to your adversaries. And Iran already has the largest ballistic missile stockpile in the Middle East. It's worked on ICBM technology in the past. So essentially all three pieces are right there. And I think that should be the focus, not this kind of weird technical focus of, do we have evidence that in a back room somewhere they're designing a bomb? I think that's missing the big picture. And the big picture is this has been a longer than 20-year effort to build nuclear weapons.
And certainly not peaceful.
Right. The purpose of a nuclear weapon, I think, for Iran is deterrence, but also coercion. I agree with Mike that I think a nuclear-armed Iran would be more aggressive, and already because of this nuclear threshold status, I think we see it being more aggressive in the region. And then I should say, I think there is also a risk of nuclear war. I think sometimes people forget that, but a nuclear-armed Iran might use nuclear weapons, and I don't think it's suicidal, but you know, the United States and the Soviet Union have come close in the past. The U.S. intelligence community estimated that there was a 50-50 chance that Putin would use nuclear weapons in Ukraine in 2022. So it's not just about what a nuclear weapon would mean for coercion or status. I think there is a real risk that Iran could use nuclear weapons. And if they have ICBMs, which is something they've worked on in the past, it could have the ability to deliver nuclear weapons to the United States, which would mean the American people would have to live under the threat of Iranian nuclear attack forever. So that's why, among the many reasons, I think it's important to stop them before they get there.
Thank you.
Afshineh, just one thing on this. I want to say that if you listen to regime officials' own words now, in fact, the way that they're talking about their own intentions is changing, and it's something we need to pay careful attention to. And I think it's actually one of the reasons why our intelligence community's assessments are changing publicly as well, because it's harder to avoid now the conclusion that this may not be, I mean, look, no U.S. Administration for many years has thought this was a peaceful nuclear program. But now, for example, we have Abbas Araghchi today, or yesterday, maybe in New York, talking about his discussions with European officials and others, saying that the atmosphere was one of diplomacy and negotiations, and everyone on the other side realizes that negotiations are the way to ensure that Iran's nuclear program remains peaceful. What he didn't say was, you know, of course Iran's nuclear program will always be peaceful. He basically said, you have to get us, you have to essentially, I mean, he didn't say it in these words, but you have to pay us to ensure that it remains peaceful. And that corresponds with changes we've seen in the rhetoric of other regime officials. Araghchi, I've sat with him, I've spoken with him. He's a person who chooses his words carefully. So I don't think this is an accident. And it gets to this point that I made before and that Matt echoed, as they have gotten closer, as the regime has gotten closer to the threshold of nuclear weapons, they've become bolder not just in their actions, but also in their rhetoric. And I'm sure they're going to be bolder in terms of what they demand at the negotiating table as well as we go forward.
Thank you. And Mike, I know I'm cognizant of time, and I know you may have to leave soon, so I just want to try and get you to answer a few more things. You lead the Washington Institute's efforts to study great power competition, and Matt, you've recently authored a book on the subject. I believe it's called We Win, They Lose. What can you both tell us about Iran's increasing ties with Russia and China, and what it may afford the regime in the nuclear space, as well as what the changing geopolitical situation with Washington may mean for Moscow and Beijing for nuclear nonproliferation?
I think this is the biggest change in the international security landscape over the past few years. If you look back even to the Biden national security strategy that was just released about 2 years ago, it talks about Russia, China, Iran, North Korea as challenges, but doesn't really talk much about the interlinkages. I think what we're seeing clearly now, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that there is this kind of new axis of autocracies. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea working together more closely. So we see joint military exercises, joint weapons production. We see Iran providing drones to Russia, China fueling Russia's war effort, North Korea providing munitions to Russia. And I do think it has implications for the nuclear program. I think it's very unlikely that we're going to get Russia and China to be tough again on Iran in the UN Security Council over its nuclear program. You know, maybe harder, surprising maybe that, just 10 years or so ago, we did think of Russia and China as partners for countering Iran's nuclear program. I think now they're going to back off. And then what is Russia providing Iran in exchange for the drones? Are they maybe providing technical assistance helpful to Iran's nuclear program? That's something I worry about. So then what does this mean for U.S. strategy? And Mike is right, you do have some people in Washington now saying, well, we need to focus on China, nothing else matters. And I think this new axis of autocracy show that doesn't make sense. I think the United States and its allies do need a strategy that can deal with Russia, China, Iran, North Korea at the same time. There was recently a National Defense Strategy Commission report co-chaired by Eric Edelman and Jane Harman that, I forget the exact term, but something like a multi-theater plan is what the United States needs, and I think that's right. So I think it would be a mistake to say we're doing China, not Iran anymore. We need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Thank you.
I agree with that. I would just say that, you know, this cooperation we see between Russia and Iran, between China and Iran, is not new. They have cooperated with one another for many decades. I think what's new is, first and foremost, China's rising economic and military might makes Chinese help to Iran much more concerning and much more effective, in a sense, from a U.S. standpoint. So go back 10, 15 years, when the U.S. was the world's largest importer of oil, China wasn't in a position to rescue Iran in the way that it is now by purchasing Iranian oil. Now China has that ability. And now China is certainly not inclined in the way that it was in the past to be as cooperative with the United States. So, you know, back in 2005 when we created the P5+1, you know, we got the cooperation of both Russia and China, not because necessarily, first and foremost, their relationship with Iran was different, but because their relationship with the United States was different, and the power dynamics in the world were different. So China has risen, has more openly challenging the United States, and one way to do that is by supporting a state like Iran, which is being targeted by American sanctions and so forth. The other interesting change is Iran's own sort of growth and capabilities. And so you've seen the Russia-Iran dynamic in a way flip, something which I'm sure gives, frankly, many Iranians no end of satisfaction. Because now you have Iran providing drones and missiles to Russia. In the past, it was the opposite. Now we can be sure, and we were talking about this earlier today, that Russia is providing something to Iran in return. And what that may be is very concerning. The U.S. government says it's nuclear cooperation or cooperation on space. We should be concerned about those things. We should want to know more about those things, frankly. But there's no doubt that Iran is helping Russia sustain its war machine in Ukraine. And this is something that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we never really would have imagined. We saw Iran as a state that was largely, you know, projecting asymmetric power, supporting terrorist groups, but we wouldn't have seen it as a state that could help Russia with its conventional military strength. So the dynamics inside that group have changed. The dynamics in the world have changed. And so this partnership amongst whatever you want to call them, U.S. adversaries for sure, is increasingly, I think, a worry and something that we need to address as a matter of our policy.
Just a footnote to that. You know, nothing the Islamic Republic does abroad is divorced from these two forces, which is status and security. And Mike is absolutely right to talk about how much joy it gives the officials of the Islamic Republic who in the early 1990s, after they were rebuilding after the Iran-Iraq War, had a whole host of delayed contracts from the Russians. The Iranians saw the speed at which the S-300 and the S-400 was deployed to Syria, but it was about a 15-year delay for them vis-a-vis the Russians to get this surface-to-air system. So they're enjoying it, but also they're getting something from it. There was a video that surfaced at the beginning of the Ukraine war, dating back to right before the pandemic in 2019, Iran's Aerospace Force Commander Hajizadeh meeting with his Russian counterpart, and he's basically shaking hands with him saying, I'll help you set up a drone command, you help me with my space command. And so it's literally a transactional partnership that is moving into the transformational period. And the problem with that is Washington still sees it not even as just transactional, or now has finally caught up to being transactional, but there's still a whole host of voices in the conventional wisdom of Washington that see exactly what you and I know, the 500-year enmity between Iran and Russia, and they say, oh no, these guys have turbulent transactions, they can never quarantine or compartmentalize their rivalry to work together. Well, guess what, they can, and they have been. Look, the Iranians and the Russians didn't see eye to eye on the tactical stuff in Syria, but they learned a lot from operating close enough together, and that was a welding tool for their partnership. There's still people who think that the Russians or the Chinese would sell the Iranians out for the right price. I think that's 2010 wisdom. Russia and China signed up, you're right, to all of those UN Security Council resolutions that said no reprocessing, no enrichment, permanent ballistic missile testing ban, permanent arms transfer ban. But that was 2010, and now this is 2024. And I think our adversaries are a lot better at fleshing out that middle part of the Venn diagram and working towards a least common denominator approach. And we, for some reason, when we have an issue with one of our partners, be it in the region or around the world, we amp up or we flesh up those differences. And I just think we need to be a bit better about compartmentalizing a lot of the problems and the prospects that we face, because unfortunately our authoritarian axis that's facing us, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, they're quite good at pushing down on what would be an impediment to their relationship and amping up what would allow them to build it. We know in exchange for the drones, they've gotten gold, they've gotten cash, they've gotten captured Western weapons. And my fear on this space thing is, Iran already has, as Matt just said, the biggest ballistic missile program in the region. Just like they've weaponized the threshold status for the nuclear, for years they've weaponized the range ban on the ballistic missiles, saying if the Europeans don't behave, we'll expand the range of our missiles. And the space program is something that gives them great cover to be able to advance those technologies without getting the reciprocal penalties. I mean, it's good news that the UK and the US finally, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, sanctioned the head of the IRGC space program. But I would say that came about 7 or 10 years too late. So the threat is fast evolving. And I think right now we have to forecast, is it the nuclear direction? Is it the conventional arms direction? Is it the sanctions busting and de-dollarization direction? What are the areas that this relationship could go? And we have to be developing those offsets right now so that when it happens, we're not caught with our pants down.
Thank you. Just along those lines also, the nuclear program in Iran has faced cyber attacks before, such as the Stuxnet virus, which targeted its enrichment facilities. How do you guys, as an added measure to sanctions, how do each of you feel cyber operations fit into the broader strategy of preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons?
So I can start, and I'd say I think it's an important component, but on its own it won't be enough. I think over the years you've sometimes had people who think that, well, we can use cyber, we can use sabotage, and that will allow us to avoid the really hard decisions like might we have to use military force someday. And I think what we've seen, even after Stuxnet, if you look at just the trend lines in Iran's enrichment program and IAEA reports, its number of centrifuges increased, the sophistication of the centrifuges, the stockpiles of low-enriched uranium. So I think their progress probably would have been faster if it hadn't been for some of the cyber and sabotage and other things. But I think we also saw that Iran continued to make progress nonetheless. So I think it should be a component, but we also shouldn't fool ourselves and think that we can just sprinkle some magic cyber dust and fix this problem.
I think Matt is right about that. I think you have to think about alongside the traditional policy measures we think about, like sanctions, stopping the regime from benefiting from oil sales, the idea of credible military threats, which we've talked about, diplomacy. You have to have a parallel effort to try to delay and obstruct a missile program or a nuclear program. And there's a number of ways you do that. Cyber is one tool to do that. But another tool that is, less trendy but equally important and we don't talk about enough are simple export control restrictions, trying to stop key components from flowing to Iran that it might use for, say, a missile program. I think it's very important that we re-energize these types of efforts, as we see, for example, Iran providing missiles and drones to Russia. There is a supply chain behind those items, just as there's a supply chain behind Iran's nuclear program. And it requires immense effort at gathering intelligence and then acting through partners to try to disrupt that supply chain. The cyber element of it, or the covert operations element of it, is the one that often gets the attention. I mean, look at the pager and walkie-talkie operation that Israel did in Lebanon. A very effective operation, one which will cause Hezbollah and Iran, frankly, to have to now re-examine their supply chains and will slow things down, but one which is a one-off, ultimately. And what you need is a multi-year sort of campaign of efforts to obstruct a missile program, a nuclear program, in parallel with the kind of bigger elements of policy aimed at sort of solving the problem, quote unquote.
Just, I'll be cognizant of time on cyber. It's one of the ingredients in the cocktail. It's not the defining ingredient, in my view. But it's also, just because it's not the defining ingredient doesn't mean it's the one that you should give up. I mean, look at what the Islamic Republic of Iran is doing to the U.S. homeland when it comes to cyber. Hacking hospitals, hacking critical infrastructure, dams, other kind of water treatment facilities. This is what the Islamic Republic of Iran is doing to the U.S. homeland using this domain. So I think in this domain, there needs to be an equal and opposite response, totally just independent of the nuclear issue, to use the cyber domain to shape the regime's risk-reward calculus and thinking about what it can do and what it can get away with and what it can't get away with. So I think just broad strokes, that's number one. Specifically tied to the nuclear issue, I think it's just one of the many tools that, the fancy technical word is shaping, to shape their calculus, but really I think you want to use cyber to handicap them. You want to use sabotage to handicap them. You want to use sanctions to handicap them. Because like we said in the beginning, the Islamic Republic of Iran has had a consistent foreign and security policy. They are punching at you like a boxer. What these tools independently do, cyber, sanctions, sabotage, kinetic action, what have you, what these tools do is at a minimum, it ties one of this boxer's hands behind its back.
Thank you, all three of you. I have 3 or 4 more questions, but I know that I think our time is up, and I wanted to open it up to maybe one question from the audience.
Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Thank you, ma'am, for doing this. Good morning to everybody.
We have one question that's directed towards Behnam. It says, given the fact that we cannot trust the official data from the Islamic Republic for its nuclear activities to monitor their activities, do you think the U.S. should take more serious measures to stop the illegal and underground testing?
Well, data is a big problem, and that's actually where the monitoring and verification mission of the International Atomic Energy Agency kicks in. I think in terms of monitoring and verification and testing, you meant the nuclear program, maybe not on the missile or military. We can have a conversation related to that after. But this is where we have to make sure the U.S. and all of the U.S.'s partners, full stop, have the support and backing and can give political cover to the International Atomic Energy Agency to do its job with respect to trying to monitor and verify the scale and scope of Iran's program. Some of you may not know, I think it's been a little over a year and a half, the Islamic Republic has been denying even visas to IAEA inspectors from Western-friendly countries just to hamper and impede this monitoring and verification mission. So yes, the data is critical, absolutely. We cannot take the Islamic Republic of Iran at its word. They've hampered these folks' monitoring and verification mission on the ground. They put political pressure on the teams when they're back in Vienna, and now they're limiting their activities in Iran by limiting the number of visas. So I think step number one is, if you do believe in peaceful means of conflict adjudication, you have to make sure that all of your diplomatic tools are back to the hilt. And I think the U.S. has left the field, and I'll put it politely, when it comes to making sure it stands wholeheartedly with the IAEA. I think the fact that it took 18 months to get a resolution of censure, that's a big problem. The fact that the Europeans, per the Wall Street Journal reporting earlier this summer, are to America's right at the IAEA is a big problem. And so yes, don't take the Iranians at their word when it comes to data. Get independent monitoring and verification and make sure that that agency is resourced and has the political capital it needs to accomplish its mission.
Thank you. Thank you to our amazing panel for today's insightful discussion. Thank you for all your insight and your knowledge. We appreciate you. And thank you to NUFDI again for everything you do day in, day out, for these wonderful conferences that you put together that are so much work and it takes so much effort from all of you at NUFDI. We thank you. We appreciate you. Please keep it going.
Thank you, panelists. Our next panel, Maximum Pressure, Maximum Support, a bipartisan approach to Iran policy, will explore alternative approaches to dealing with the Islamic Republic, emphasizing the importance of maximum pressure combined with maximum support for the Iranian people. We will be joined by Ray Takye, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Jason Brodsky, Policy Director at United Against Nuclear Iran, and Patricia Karam, Senior Policy Advisor on Iran at Freedom House. Moderating this panel is author and journalist Jonathan Harunhoff.
A last-minute change-up. I am not Jonathan Harunhoff. So I will be moderating the panel, Andrew Galili, Senior Policy Analyst with NUFDI. Thank you all for joining on this awesome panel today. We will be focusing on maximum support. As many of you know, 2 years ago, NUFDI presented its strategic policy initiative called Maximum Support. The idea and the concept being that while maximum pressure is a necessary component of what should be the Iran policy for the United States, it is not sufficient to bring about the change in Iran that we all desire and all need. The secondary component that is complementary to that is supporting the Iranian people. So today we have an awesome panel to discuss both that concept and why that concept and that policy needs to be bipartisan and needs to be supported by both parties, by everyone, and it should be a universal policy. So thank you all for joining. Thank you. The paper with the questions. Okay. Thank you. Ray, I first wanted to start with you. If you can just talk a little bit about how, you're an expert not only on Iran policy, but on Iranian history. And if you can talk a little bit about sanctions on Iran, sanctions policy, how they've evolved over time, how the regime has adapted to them, and how they can be adjusted to be more effective. You can talk broadly, specifically, please.
Thanks. Sanctions actually began quite early on the Islamic Republic. They began in 1979, particularly with the advent of the hostage crisis. And at that time, it was gradualist. I think Iran continued to sell United States oil into the 1980s when that finally stopped. By the 1990s, you began to see the sanctions regime trying to affect Iran's trade abroad by essentially becoming secondary in scope. Namely, if you're a European firm or a European company and you're selling or purchasing material from Iran, you could be subject to secondary sanctions. That became very controversial in US-European relations and with other countries. So those secondary sanctions were never applied with that much vigor and consistency, simply because it created a lot of problems in the transatlantic alliance. With the Europeans, but other stakeholders as well. Probably in the 21st century, around 2004 or 5, something earlier, Stuart Levy, who worked in the Treasury Department at the time, did something quite extraordinary. He reconceptualized the sanctions policy. He took an existing policy and reconceptualized it. That almost never happens in US government. And essentially what he did was to use almost criminal statutes to deal with Iranian commerce. In essence, it meant that Iran could still sell its products abroad, but it would have difficulty repatriating the financial rewards. So its money was locked into banks abroad, whether South Korea, Europe, and so forth. So essentially, you took the ball, not so much trying to retard Iran's oil exports, but essentially preventing Iran from benefiting from those exports in terms of repatriation of its profits. The Islamic Republic has been resilient. It has fought back in a variety of means and has even accepted that it will have a diminished economic impact growth as a result of the sanctions policy. The key to determining the efficacy of sanctions policy is not whether it depletes the treasury of the country, whether it's punitive in that sense. Does it change the strategic calculus? To a large extent, it has affected Iran's thinking in some ways, but it has not been overwhelmingly impacted the strategic calculus on core issues. And that was talked about today, earlier, in terms of the gravity of the Iranian problem. So sanctions is a viable coercive tool, but I do think, sitting here today, we have exaggerated its strategic impact.
Thank you, Ray. Patricia, building a little bit off of that, how can the United States and its allies enhance the effectiveness of economic and political pressure on Iran, on the Islamic Republic?
Well, I mean, maybe it dovetails well with what Ray has been saying, or maybe it will then prompt a response for him, because I was actually going to draw upon a brief that we did at Freedom House that was focused on putting pressure or increasing the pressure on the regime. And my starting point was going to be in terms of enhancing the effectiveness of economic and political pressure, talking about more diligent and effective sanctions enforcement, which might have the ability to constrain the regime's sort of internal repressive and regional activities. And I say this because many of you know that while Iran is one of the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world and has itself spent sort of decades in evasion, enforcement has really been lacking, especially against those who continue to purchase oil. So building upon some of the recommendations in the brief, we sort of talked about the importance of enhancing enforcement by working with allies to ensure that different restrictions are operating in harmony. We talked a lot about, we looked a lot about sanctions collaboration, especially with European jurisdictions, emphasizing sort of, with an emphasis on functionality and building sort of a common multilateral floor of export controls, designated persons and prohibited transactions, and due diligence methodology. And this would sort of allow Washington to sort of present a united front in sort of countering abuses of the global financial system and place more pressure on countries that are known to not to comply or to have a weak compliance, like UAE, Turkey, and China. We also looked at, I mean, the importance of targeting the networks of front companies and intermediaries that allow sort of sanctioned entities to continue to do business, and targeting them. And one novelty, I guess, but you know, everybody in the room is following this issue closely. The Chinese teapots in particular, for example, which are these privately owned Chinese petrochemical refiners that are, as the largest buyers of illicit crude oil, have really aided Iran's sanctions evasion quite extensively and should be sanctioned. And so, relatedly, I'm sure Jason will talk about this or refer to it, efforts to identify and sanctions, I mean, something Ioanni has worked on quite extensively, the vessels that transport the Iranian petroleum in violation of existing sanctions. These efforts to kind of target them should be intensified. And then briefly, I mean, very quickly, I want to talk about China and the role that China plays in evasion, and the room that there is potentially for the US to appeal to China's economic interests to secure some cooperation on Iran. And you know, this could be controversial, but that's an idea we sort of talk about, especially if nuclear talks resume. And the idea being that the US is China's really most important economic counterpart. So the stakes of the Chinese government's relations with Tehran are much lower by comparison. So China could be sensitive, I mean, because its interests in the Middle East are oil extraction and other economic pursuit, it's sort of sensitive, or it has a proclivity towards stability, which don't necessarily go hand in hand with Iran's efforts at fomenting instability. So I want to just, a couple of things before I conclude. On the human rights front, what is especially needed is also a comprehensive strategy of accountability for human rights abusers and corrupt officials, and this could be linked, others have talked about it, to visa bans and asset freezes that are imposed. Another important component before I conclude of the effectiveness or key element of the effectiveness of any policy to pressure the regime is really the need at this juncture to address Tehran's support of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And we see that the Iranian regime has benefited greatly from cooperation with Moscow. It's received a steady support of aid and military supply in return for drones and missiles that are deployed in Ukraine. Now, this is an area where sanctions can be deployed, and they need to be imposed on these entities that are involved in, or at least redoubled, in the export of drone technology. But to go back to something you said in the beginning and to conclude, more importantly, I think, is the need to develop a new and improved policy on Iran, one that has bipartisan support, and that will ensure sustained implementation. We know that for the last decade or so, US policy towards Iran has really been refracted through the lens of the JCPOA, which has led to a huge partisan divide on how to confront Iran. And so I think the evolution that has happened with the Gaza war and Iran's role should be a bit of a wake-up call and should kind of demonstrate the need for a more coherent, sort of long-term, bipartisan strategy that leverages a number of tools, which include foreign policy, information campaigns, diplomacy, sanctions, and other forms of deterrence. So I'll end at here, and apologies for going on too long.
No, thank you. I think your point about China is especially interesting. On our panel on the new axis of evil yesterday, we heard the panelists make the point, while China is extremely important to Iran, Iran is not extremely important to China, which I think is what you were getting at a little bit. Shifting a little bit, as you can see on the screen here, this is the summary of NUFDI and FDD's joint maximum support initiative, where we took ideas from both of our maximum support initiatives and summarized. So, Jason, I wanted to ask you a little bit about this concept. You've long been an advocate for maximum pressure. Why do some of these things in maximum support, enforcing oil petrochemical sanctions, placing restrictions and sanctions on regime officials? If you want, you can get a little bit into the lack of restrictions on regime officials at the UN this week, which is astounding, and I know you've written a lot about. But more broadly as well, why does this concept resonate?
Well, thanks, Andrew, and it's great to be with you and NUFDI again, and I see a lot of friends in the room, so it's wonderful to be with you all. To add to what Ray and Patricia have said, and I completely agree with their points, I would say U.S. policy from Iran tends to focus solely on sanctions because it's the most politically convenient and the easiest tool for policymakers to employ. But what we are missing is a diplomatic isolation campaign against the Islamic Republic, and also, yes, the development of a credible military threat. So let me explain to you what I mean by that. The maximum pressure campaign is not only economic. Yes, we need better sanctions enforcement, as Patricia was saying. The Islamic Republic has been able to earn close to $100 billion since 2021 as a result of lax sanctions enforcement. And that's partly a policy choice by the Biden administration. And it's also a structural issue because the P5+1 is really not a viable entity anymore for dealing with the challenge of the Islamic Republic of Iran because of great power competition with Russia and China. So that is something that has been a weakness in U.S. policy since 2021. The U.S. government has also not implemented the MASA Act yet, which is a very important part of the calculus here. This is a very important piece of legislation that I know means a lot to the Iranian-American community. It's something that NUFDI has really championed, and this is something that would penalize the top officials in the Islamic Republic in a way that they have not been to date, like the supreme leader. If we're able to sanction Bashar al-Assad and Nicolas Maduro and a whole range of other world leaders, we should also be willing to sanction Ali Khamenei under counterterrorism and human rights abuse authorities. It's just unacceptable to me, this delay and this hesitancy to sanction him. Putting sanctions aside for a second, there's also a diplomatic isolation component here that the United States and its allies I sadly say, have completely dropped the ball on. We had a situation this week at the UN in New York where we had a large Iranian delegation come. Around 40 people were there. The president, the foreign minister, and the vice president for strategic affairs, Javad Zarif, who was under personal sanctions, as many of you know, by the US government. This should not have happened. First of all, yes, I get the stock answer from the State Department. The United States has an obligation under the UN headquarters agreement to grant visas. Okay, the United States does not have to grant every visa. It's not a blank check for foreign influence operations from a hostile foreign power for the United States to just let in anyone. So that has been a very big disappointment for me to witness over the last week. I think the United States did have an opportunity to make a point by saying you are not going to have the permissive environment to run wild in Manhattan as you have been in the past, going on multiple cable news networks and engaging in disinformation and propaganda because, oh, by the way, it's not only an insult to the Iranian people, it's also a threat to U.S. national security and democracy to give a platform to a propagandist like Javad Zarif, who went on not one, but at least 3 American networks, CNN, NBC, and PBS. And CNN didn't have just one Iranian official on, they had 2. So the hostile foreign powers like the Islamic Republic take advantage of our open airwaves, and they engage in disinformation and malign influence operations, and we just allow it. And I think that we could be much more creative and take more initiative in limiting the ability of the Islamic Republic to engage in this kind of behavior. So that was something that I think was a big flaw for the U.S. government, and we could be doing much more of it. We could be doing much more to isolate the Islamic Republic in international bodies. They maintain leadership roles in UN entities, the UN Human Rights Council, you know, the list goes on. It's just laughable how and we lack a structure in the U.S. government to push back in a very agile way against this kind of infiltration at international bodies, and that has to change, and that is important. Some people may think it's petty, but it's actually, the Islamic Republic puts a lot of onus and emphasis on its own legitimacy internationally and its own image internationally, as crazy as that sounds. They do like playing with the big boys on the international world stage. So if we limit their ability to do so, yes, I do think that that will help advance U.S. national security interests. And last and certainly not least, we do need a credible military threat against the regime in the Islamic Republic. First of all, one of the key weaknesses in my view of U.S. policy has been the fact that we have not imposed consistently a direct cost on the Islamic Republic for its aggression against the Iranian people and Americans and our allies abroad. It's one of the glaring weaknesses. It's something that has plagued not only the Biden administration, but Republicans and previous Democratic administrations alike. And this has been extremely debilitating, I should say, for U.S. policy, because Khamenei just waits us out. Every 4 years or every 8 years, we get a new president, and he plays a survival game, and he knows how to influence and survive, and that's all he does. So all of these need to be put together in a grand strategy, and I would conclude by saying, and last and certainly not least, maximum support has to be part of that equation. You need to set the table with a maximum pressure campaign, but you need to bolster it with a maximum support campaign for the Iranian people. And what that should be entail is why are we granting visas to the Islamic Republic when we can be engaging in a humanitarian parole campaign for those Iranians who have been wounded by the regime in protests and to be able to, so they can get medical care in the United States. It's hard, very complicated to do, but our government should be investing the resources to make this happen. We've done it with Ukraine. We should be doing it with Iran. We could be doing a lot more as well with our revitalizing Voice of America and our social media work for the U.S. government. It's not pulsing and not keyed to what is happening on the ground in Iran, and it's not resonating with people. Our material is stale and detached from the day-to-day reality over there. And so there's a lot there, and also Strike Fund and a lot of other initiatives, Starlink. So these are a lot that we can go into later on, but that's how I'd answer your question, Andrew.
Thank you, Jason. As you said, we will circle back to some of the things that you brought up, especially on human rights. I quickly want to touch on regime change. Our next panel will be discussing after lunch why a free Iran is beneficial to America and why its values would align with America. Ray, I think it used to be a taboo topic to speak about. I would like to think NUFDI has been part of changing that narrative where it's now pretty openly talked about in this space. But you've said, perhaps controversially for some, that the only U.S. administration to have ever had a regime change policy towards Iran was the Carter administration. Why have administrations of both parties since then refused to do this, and is there any hope that that can change?
Well, I should say, in the archival record that I have seen, I haven't seen everything, the only time I saw a presidential directive ordering United States agencies to work toward displacing an Iranian government was in December 1979, 1 month after the hostage crisis. And it was issued by Jimmy Carter. It went through 2 iterations. It's only a brief paragraph, that's all it is. It went through 2 drafts. The first draft did not include the word replacing the current government with a democratic government. It just said replacing it with a different. So Carter hand-marked it democratic. So that became the second draft. I think it was somewhere around December 79. Then a committee was established to execute the policy, a 3-person committee. Ironically enough, it didn't have any representative from the intelligence community. It had a State Department representative, Defense Department representative, and it was chaired by David Aaron, still alive. And the actual, what it did seems murky, but it was supposed to work with regional allies, which were Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. It spent some money in an Iranian presidential election that took place at that time, I think ineffectively. And it might have done other things. I don't know the programmatic aspect of it because they remain very much classified. Did other administrations have similar policy? I do think that policy was discontinued by Reagan administration simply because they were so focused on the Soviet Union, less so on smaller regional actors. Since then, I think the issue that has overwhelmed others, there are 2 reasons I should backtrack why this has not been more traction. Number 1 is the sheer durability of the regime. When Carter made that pronouncement, the Islamic Republic was a year old. The regime has been durable, and many people suggest, as they often do with durable regimes, that that durability will persist. Second of all, I think there is once arms control gets into the picture, that becomes the priority of the United States government. And for arms control to be resolved diplomatically, it requires an interlocutor. And that's where you see dealing with nation state as such. The difficulty of it, the improbability of it from perspective of many, and the durability of the regime and the advent of arms control, which dominates the agenda of both political parties and the international community, I think militate against that sort of a thing at this point.
Thank you. As we said, we'll circle back to the human rights a little bit. Patricia, as you can see on our maximum support, a few of the concepts are including engaging with the opposition, providing cyber and intelligence support to Iranians on the ground, providing internet access to Iranians on the ground, supporting labor strikes. What specific forms of support can be provided to both Iranian civil society and to opposition groups or the diaspora to help this movement?
I looked at it a little bit in a different way because I think given the state of affairs, and I will touch upon some of the themes that you brought up or strategies, I thought the question should be what could we do or what is there to do to prevent further shrinking of the civic space and violation and increasing violations of human rights. And to do so, I think there are a number of things, I mean, one can do and one is doing. But organizations, for example, like Freedom House and others can still play a role in supporting activists and protesters. And obviously, the most obvious thing that one can think about is the strategy of naming and shaming, and enabling, identifying violators and connecting that information to a broader audience, coupled with some advocacy within sort of NGO networks to isolate the government. Relatedly, and I think more robust communication, I think, Jason, you mentioned it, by all involved, including the USG, should really be employed to name and shame the regime, officials, allies, businesses, expose corrupt practices, and really shine light on human rights abuses. So forceful public diplomacy efforts need to kind of integrate all sorts of efforts, including mapping, this issue of mapping IRGC networks and front companies that are active and take advantage of the situation. And I think the use of media, social media, mobile apps with high rates of engagement by Iranians is critical, combined with the circumvention tools that you mentioned, internet filtering and surveillance that would boost kind of the reach of any public diplomacy campaign. I think also doing that would underscore sort of, or in particular looking at highlighting human rights abuses and exposing corruption would underscore US and international support for Iranians' democratic aspirations. Now, the presence in terms of the diaspora and maybe in relationship to the Mahsa Amini protest a little bit, what has helped create more of attraction at some point was the presence also of Iranians in European parliaments and governments, which also contributed to helping sort of demands reach the global scene. And that was evident in particular after the Mahsa Amini protests. Despite sort of imperfect internet penetration, I think the social media activity of the diaspora, especially on Twitter and Instagram, has really improved the coverage of what's happening inside the country and of the repression that is ongoing. So I do think the internet has helped sort of create a burgeoning inside-outside community of activists that is active and has enabled kind of a broader influence, has increased their influence on the global public sphere. And I think this really needs to be sustained. And here, internet freedom really needs to be adopted as a goal to help activists sustain their work without evidently trying to not to endanger or expose them, and ultimately create pressure from both inside and outside, create pressure on the regime. One such effort, by the way, I mention it because I was involved in a recent briefing on the Hill about it, is the Iran Act, which will create really a legal environment for the US government to implement a strategy to promote internet access for all Iranians. So I do want to underscore that pressure, in my opinion, should be sustained internally and externally in that form, and that support should not stop so that Iranians don't feel abandoned, Iranians inside. I think at the moment, activists in Iran face the long-term prospect of ongoing repression, but I do think that discontent is unlikely to die out soon, given that these grievances are widespread and sort of rooted in structural factors that cannot be addressed overnight. So I think Iranian advocacy groups need to sustain efforts to really keep pressure on the government from below, and need to be helped by the international community to put the pressure on the outside by shining light on what's happening.
Thank you, Patricia. I want to stick on the human rights. I think some of us have a tendency to view what goes on in Iran as too US-centric, perhaps, and too related to what the US does. But with that said, there is a clear correlation between US policy on Iran, or broad US policy on Iran, and what happens inside of Iran. So NUFDI put out a chart with some data showing during maximum pressure, things like oil exports, even their nuclear program, military expenditure were all lower, much lower than during the past few years of what we would call a posture of appeasement. But not only have those security risks been different during those two periods, but so has the human rights situation in Iran. Executions were lower in Iran during the period of maximum pressure. Even hostage taking from other countries, things like that, were lower during that period of maximum pressure. So building a little bit on that, and what you've already spoken about a little bit, how can human rights be integrated more into a new Iran policy, understanding that these things are tied together?
This is for me?
Please, yes.
Okay. Well, that's a good question, Andrew. I would say I think we need to develop first an architecture for even having these conversations about an Iran strategy that's comprehensive, one that underpins maximum pressure and maximum support. In my opinion, the U.S. government is not doing that. The Biden administration came into office with a thesis that it could revive the JCPOA. That failed. And we have still not been able to take the message that it's over. So we have a situation where both parties are relitigating what happened with the JCPOA. And they spend more time relitigating what happened with the JCPOA than talking about what we should do now. And that is one of the big Achilles heels I think that we have. So when I talk about an architecture, I think that in order to be able to have these conversations about human rights, and this is where it relates to your question, I think we should be looking to what we did with China policy and developing a bipartisan committee or commission that really allows the U.S. government, members of Congress, on a bipartisan basis to have these conversations. We're not doing it right now. And I think what could bring them together, one of the things is human support for the Iranian people and addressing human rights abuses. That's one of the planks that I think can find Democrats and Republicans to bring them together. But we don't have that architecture in place in Washington to be able to even start to have that conversation on what would be a sustainable policy for the United States government in the long run. We should have had it after the JCPOA negotiation revival collapsed, but there has been an inability to have those conversations and to develop that kind of infrastructure. And I think that that's been a tragedy, really, because we've missed years. We've wasted years here. When we could have been developing some of the tools in the U.S. government to address a lot of these issues that you say.
Thank you. A reminder to the audience, please submit questions through the QR code. If you have any questions for the panel, we'll be getting to that portion of the panel shortly. As somewhat of a closing remarks, maybe summarizing some of all of your points, if you can just explain a little bit, what would a comprehensive maximum pressure, maximum support strategy combining these things look like in practice? Ray, we can start with you,
on
please.
the issue of human rights, about 10 years ago, I spent a lot of time, completely wasted time on the Hill, trying to advocate for a human rights commission of some sort on the Hill, and there was no interest in it. There's a lot of complicated reasons for that. The standing committees, like foreign affairs committees, don't like those kind of commissions and others because it intersects with their authority. So there's that parochial Hill interest. I would say if there is going to be a human rights campaign, it has to originate in Congress. It's not going to originate in the executive branch. Historically, executive branch has not been interested in this issue, with some exceptions, unless there's pressure from the Hill. The Bureau of Human Rights was actually initiated during the Kissinger tenure at the State Department, and Kissinger had no interest in human rights, none. But it was in response to congressional pressure. Second of all, congressional pressure succeeds when there's a congressional champion for human rights. In case of the Soviet dissidents, it was Henry Jackson of Washington State, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. There was someone of significance and stature who could embrace the issue and hold on to it. That person, as far as I know, doesn't exist today. That can actually move that ball forward on the Hill. Finally, I will say one thing. With a human rights policy, you have to say, what is your objective in terms of human rights policy? Is your objective to negotiate with the regime to improve the condition of dissidents? Historically, that has been the human rights policy of the United States toward Latin America, trying to negotiate with the regimes in order to improve prisons and other things. Or is your support for dissidents designed to displace and overthrow the existing government? These are two different policies and two different very approaches, both in terms of composition and coercion. So that's one thing that has to be considered. If your objective is the support of dissidents in order to displace the government, then you get into an area of controversy. Then you get into an area of non-partisan divide. Partisan divide between the parties and within the Republican Party. So this is not just the red and blue issue. It traverses the boundaries of politics. I would say one thing about the struggle in Iran today. This is not a revolutionary struggle. Revolutions don't take 10 years to unfold. What you have in Iran is a persistent struggle between the population and the ruling regime. It's a persistent, ongoing struggle which at times is stalemated. At times the regime seems to be benefiting, at times the forces of dissent seems to be benefiting. But it is a long-term, persistent struggle. The Islamic Republic is not going to be overthrown, it's going to be weakened historically if this struggle continues with success. And a long-time struggle requires a long-time support from the United States predicated on a bipartisan architecture. And that's just not available because of the nuclear issue. The most brilliant thing the Iranian government has done was to get a nuclear weapons program, because that sucks all the oxygen out of the room. It essentially leads you to deal with the incumbent government, which is the only one that can impose restrictions on this nuclear program through a negotiated settlement. And that actually means exclusion of other considerations, particularly on the issue of human rights. Now, I suspect the next administration that has an agreement with Iran on the nuclear issue will have a human rights component, and it will be a phony one, because you have to have one as a talking point. Because the architects of JCPOA said, well, we reserve the right to sanction Iran on issues of human rights. None of you upholding the JCPOA. The JCPOA Annex 3 was complete, comprehensive sanctions relief. So you do stuff like designations, which are the junk food of sanctions. It makes everybody feel good, but it had no effect. So you need some sort of comprehensive strategy, because the struggle within Iran is a protracted one.
That's a really good point. I think one of the big lies as this administration was attempting to renegotiate the new JCPOA was we would only be lifting non-nuclear sanctions. I mean,
by the way,
nuclear
can I just say
sanctions
one
and
thing about
non-nuclear
that?
sanctions would remain.
Can I say about that, if I don't mean to be disturbed? There is no such thing as a non-nuclear sanctions. There is no such thing as a nuclear sanction. When the United States Congress imposed sanctions, it did so on Iran's terrorist activities, proliferation concerns, as well as human rights abuses. Nuclear sanction is a term that John Kerry made up. And he used that to essentially dismantle the architecture of sanctions as you look at the JCPOA Annex. There is no such thing as a nuclear sanction. The United States Congress never, ever passed strict nuclear sanctions. It passed sanctions on Iran and totality of its activity. Nuclear sanction is a term coined by John Kerry that doesn't exist in reality. It's not part of the elemental charts. It's not a matter. It doesn't exist. But that's where we're at now.
Please.
Sure. I would add this, and I agree with what Ray just said, and I would add one thing we haven't spoken about is the behavior of our allies in Europe. This has been a persistent source of frustration, I know, for Democrats, Republicans, and yours truly, and many Iranians in the diaspora. Our allies in Europe have a lot of exposure to the Islamic Republic, but they have not kept up with the sanctions designations that the United States has put on. They have provided a permissive environment for Islamic Republic embassies to operate, which are used, as many of you know, to foment terrorism against members of the Iranian diaspora, and not only them, but also the Israeli interests and also the Jewish community in Europe as well. They have Islamic centers that the regime uses to, Khamenei has representatives in European capitals, and they use these ways to radicalize the population in Europe and to get out Khamenei's propaganda. There has not been a concerted crackdown on a lot of these efforts, and denying space, I keep saying this, but denying space for the regime to engage in these kinds of operations is absolutely critical, and I have not seen a concerted effort in Europe to do that. I think we've made a real step in the right direction in Germany with the Islamic Center of Hamburg that was recently closed, thankfully, after Ioanni shared evidence with the German Interior Ministry of unbelievable radicalization happening out of that center. There were police raids across the country. That should be repeated in every major European capital, because if the Islamic Center of Hamburg is doing it, the Islamic Center of England is doing it. Stockholm as well. Vienna as well. So the list goes on. So the United States should be taking a leadership role here in working with our allies and developing a coalition of countries that are prepared to take aggressive steps to curtail the space of the Islamic Republic, and we're not doing that. We're not creating a coalition of countries to do that. The P5+1 construct that was developed to deal with the nuclear issue is just not viable right now, and I think that policymakers accept that, but there has not been an attempt to create a new architecture of countries that are willing to undertake these kinds of measures to isolate the Islamic Republic, just as look at what Europe did with Putin and Russia. It denied Russian aircraft the use of European airspace. Just recently, there was an attempt to do that with Iran Air, but there's apparently a wind-down time of a year that didn't exist for Russia, interestingly enough. But Europe has a lot of touch points, and I don't see the United States really engaging in the pressuring its allies to step up here. We have a very robust sanctions architecture, as many of you know, but our allies have not kept up with it. I could go on and on. Members of the Five Eyes, who we share intelligence with, they haven't designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization as we have done. I think it's an outrage. So they should be doing that, and we should be putting a lot of pressure on our allies to take this step. If they want our help with Ukraine and other parts that are important to European security, they should be willing to take steps that are important to American security as well and American interests, and it's important to their interests as well. I think the threat perception in Europe has changed recently with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Iran providing drones and ballistic missiles to the Russians, but I haven't seen them take the steps that are necessary to join with the United States in really cracking down on the Islamic Republic. And it goes beyond Washington. It's all in Europe. Australia, New Zealand, these are important places that a lot of people don't talk about, but for the Islamic Republic, they use it as a platform for terrorism and influence operations, and we're just very behind the ball. We're reactive, we're not even active in many cases, and it's a tragedy, I think, but that has to be part of a strategy. Can't just be in the United States. We have to start coming up with a coalition of countries that are willing to take these steps with us, and I haven't seen the U.S. government do it.
Thank you, Jason. I haven't heard too many people bring up the Five Eyes point, and that's shocking and outrageous. I think also I want to commend Ioanni for that work on the Islamic centers, and you guys have inspired us at NUFDI to dig a little deeper on that and expose some more, so keep an eye on that space. Patricia, please.
Yeah, I mean, all I can say is to underscore a bit some of what others have said, but in particular going back to the partisan divide, I think the balance between support and pressure to effect presumably behavioral change is a function, key to this is a bipartisan approach to, I cannot repeat it enough in this idea of a bipartisan approach to dealing with Iran, because I think what hasn't worked is how divided policymakers are on this issue. And I do think a U.S. approach has to foster coalitions, bipartisan coalitions at home, and as Jason pointed out, build cooperation with regional partners towards a more integrated sort of multilateral policy on how to deal with threats coming out of Iran, but also how to create openings for change. I do want to just flag one thing that we didn't talk about, which is a bit of a new reality that could inform policy, which this is, again, in light of some major shifts in the global order that have taken place. We've seen the emergence, I've pointed this out, of a group of authoritarian partners, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, that are increasingly coordinating action in opposition to the US and democratic interests. And some, for example, I'll touch upon this very briefly, that are evident in trends, for example, towards movements towards alternative currencies and really the embrace of non-dollar systems. Specifically those, for example, based on the yuan for major transaction, and this brings with it the potential erosion in the long term. I do recognize this as a long term of influence and enforcement power, especially with regards to sanctions. So currently, the stat that I have is only 10% of Iran's trade is conducted in dollars. I don't know, Jason, maybe you have better stats, but this is sort of worrying. And I'll conclude with something positive, but before that, I do want to throw out my worry, and maybe that comes back to how Ray started the panel. This question of whether the Iranian regime's policy of, you called it, I think, it's survival game, let's call it strategic patience, its autocratic character, its growing bilateral relationships with malign, let's say, powers, and the sophistication of its sanctions evasion tactics. The worry is, has this diminished the potency of constraints on its behavior? And I think maybe that's a question for Ray in particular. But just to end on a positive note, in the sense that one idea that has come out is this idea, I think, Behnam, you were the one who sort of mentioned it to me. Behnam is sitting there. This idea of how to build a political consensus for a policy, for a bipartisan policy on Iran, is to create a bipartisan committee in Congress that's similar to the one that's focused on China, and really task it with addressing and monitoring sort of the range of security, economic, foreign policy, human rights issues related to Iran. And such a committee may potentially be called upon to develop a framework that defines sort of the goals of, for example, Iran's sanctions, or and it could be an exercise in bipartisan collaboration and maybe spur some sort of agreement on next steps.
I'll just say one thing. If there was a Biden administration official here, they would actually say that the Iran policy has been successful. And if you kind of look at it narrowly, there's an internal logic to that argument. Because what do they really care about? They care not about the status of the Iranian nuclear program, but the Iranian bomb. And last time I checked, as of today, there's no mushroom cloud over Isfahan, Tabriz, Mashhad, Qazvin, pick a city. For Antony Blinken, that's a good day. And so far, there has not been one. So they could come back and say, we don't know why they haven't detonated. But the fact is they haven't. So the status quo is not necessarily unsatisfactory. And so why poke the bear? You know, we're almost 4 years done with the Biden administration. I didn't see a mushroom cloud. So from that narrow perspective, the policy is successful and not antagonizing Ali Khamenei excessively. You know, they don't care about the human rights issues. Most people don't, frankly. Malign regional activities are disturbing but manageable. What they really care about is the bomb. Not even the status of the nuclear program, how sophisticated it is. Because if they want to cross the threshold, they can cross the threshold. The fact is they haven't. And so the answer, I come back to what they will say to you, to me, to Jason, why poke the bear?
That logic it unfortunately leads to why would you ever poke the bear and why would they ever build a bomb, right? They would stay where they are. They've built the deterrence. They can do what they want. and that's better. So it is unfortunately short-sighted, I would say, but that's a good summary. I think if we have any audience questions, we can move to that part. Do we? Yes, please.
This is directed to Jason. Everyone knows sanctions are insufficient. Why is it that the U.S. has not worked with opposition groups and such prominent opposition figures like Reza Pahlavi?
That's a very good question. I have a big idea that I want to share with all of you, one of them. The president has an advisory committee on the African diaspora. Why don't we have a presidential advisory committee on the Iranian diaspora? That would provide an avenue, a platform for these kinds of conversations. We don't have that. And I know they're very different situations, but I think that having a structure in place to be able to have those kinds of feedback is one of the things that the U.S. government is missing. So that's something that I've thought of in recent weeks, actually. I stumbled upon that Presidential Advisory Committee on the African Diaspora. So that's one area that we can have these conversations with opposition leaders so that the U.S. government can develop better policy. Right now, we're not having that those conversations consistently. The State Department will say, oh, we invite an Iranian dissident over every year or so. We take a photo, and we continue to do and double down on the same failed approaches that we've done in the past. But if the U.S. government wanted to really invest in a successful Iran policy, we need to create the structures in place to be able to make that successful, and we're not doing it. And so that's just one thing I have, that one tangible idea of something that we can do. We can also be engaging just a lot more with, as I said before, on the diplomatic isolation side, elevating voices in the Iranian diaspora and the Iranian opposition to represent the Iranian people as opposed to the Islamic Republic's representatives. I think what in 2022, during the Massa revolution, what was so powerful was when we had Reza Pahlavi and others at the Munich Security Conference representing the Iranian people. That was really powerful stuff. And the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic, was disinvited. And they were fuming. They were livid over it. We should be trying to pursue more of those opportunities in international fora, but we're not. We only do it when there's a crisis. And that's very sad.
Still a few minutes if there's any more.
I can ask one more. This is for Ray. You've previously said, when it comes to supporting the people of Iran, tell me something more than just reforming the VOA. Now NUFDI and FDD have outlined 15 specific points to do that. How do you think we can galvanize support for such measures?
I didn't quite hear the question.
Sorry, could you repeat the question, Nina?
If you can just repeat the question.
You've previously said, when it comes to supporting the people of Iran, tell me something more than just reforming the VOA. Now NUFDI and FDD have outlined 15 specific points to do that. How do you think we can galvanize support for such measures?
You mean beyond, what can you do beyond VOA broadcasts? Is that, yeah. I have always said that when we discuss this issue, I don't want to hear about VOA broadcasts because that's what everybody talks about. During his playing days, Larry Bird used to yell at referees saying, is this it or you're playing to get better? Whenever I hear about VOA, I say, is this it or you're playing to get better? First of all, I think you need what has been suggested here, a comprehensive strategy that involves all aspects of the United States government, supported by Congress, but also civil society advocates. The Darfur issue was hugely important once George Clooney got into it. He just highlighted it. And you saw that to some extent during the Green Movement. The Iranian people do not lack information about what's wrong with their government. Actually, their own press sort of covers that to some extent. You need to have a sophisticated conversation with a public whose political culture is rather sophisticated. To this day, I don't believe there has been a Secretary of State who has made a speech on Iranian human rights issues. From Cy Vance to Tony Blinken. I don't think that has happened. And also, everybody has to appreciate that this is going to be a protracted struggle. It's going to be a long-term struggle. The rewards are not going to be immediate or readily available. It's going to be a long-term struggle of gradually eroding the power of the Islamic government to the point of facilitating its collapse. The Iranian government can only be overthrown by the Iranian people themselves, but that doesn't mean that the United States and the international community cannot create a context and conditions where the regime weakens. The purpose of the United States policy should be to weaken the Iranian regime through all measures, economic, cyber, civil society, human rights advocacy, whatever it is. The problem with this approach is, it's going to be a protracted, coercive approach, is that it is inconsistent with arms control timelines. Because every day there'll be IAEA reports saying they're 2.5 weeks away from having enough fissile material for a bomb. And that energizes everybody behind that particular goal. So there's an immediate urgency of the nuclear program, and there's a long-term aspect of it. And what I say, should the Iranian regime at some point cross the threshold and actually assemble a bomb, then it will be considered too big to fail. Then the entire international community will be invested in its prolongation. When the North Korean leader came to power, Kim Jong-un, nobody knew anything about him. Yet everybody wanted him to succeed because of the command control issues. They didn't know his name, they didn't know his age, they didn't know if he was a sadist, which he turned out to be. But nevertheless, once you're in a possession of a nuclear bomb, then your regime will be viewed as a necessary and responsible custodian of that bomb, particularly if they don't blow things up. Then the argument would be that they have dealt with the bomb issue pragmatically and judiciously, and so we have to maintain that relationship with the government for fear of a future government that may have a different approach to it, a more bellicose approach to it. So the nuclear issue is a no-lose issue for the Iranian government.
Did anyone want to add to that before the next question?
Well, I would also just add just on the nuclear file, and I know I didn't speak about this, but I think we need to start taking the message that we are never going to be able to have a sustainable nuclear deal with the Islamic Republic as long as it remains the Islamic Republic. And I think U.S. policymakers and the international community have not been able to get and accept the message. Get the message. It's not going to happen. So, I love the IAEA Director General, who's a great guy, but, he comes out of the UN meeting saying, I sense a new, re-engagement from the Iranian regime. They're ready to engage. All the Islamic Republic's diplomats have to do is smile, and everyone is saying they're moderating. It's crazy. So, and we have a 40-year case study of failed diplomacy. And I know we have a poverty of really ideas in terms of how to get to a better Iran strategy, and it's not perfect, and a lot of it's very difficult to get to that. But we're not thinking in a creative manner, and I think that the ideas that you hear today present some of the building blocks for how to get there. And there can be, you can deter the Iranian regime without a nuclear deal. But it takes risks, it takes policymakers acknowledging and making hard choices, and that's not always popular in Washington.
Thank you. Nina, I think we have time for one more, if there is. Otherwise, we can...
Sure, there's one more for Jason, if we want to get to it. How can Europeans, specifically the UK, crack down on IR centers like the Islamic Center of England, whose director, Hashemi Mousavi, is Khamenei's personal rep in the UK? Is there something that needs to be mirrored within the United States? Will US cooperation on this front bring down this massive propaganda network?
Well, I think that you look at some of the sanctions designations that the United States government has undertaken. We have sanctioned Al-Mustafa University, which is a notorious exporter of the Islamic Republic's ideology, and not just ideology, it's also terrorist plots. And our UK and European allies have not sanctioned them, and they should. The Islamic Center of England has operated for a very long time as Khamenei's personal representative. They have engaged in commemorations of Qasem Soleimani, who has the blood of UK soldiers on his hands. There have been reports of Iranian-backed operatives at some of the pro-Hamas protests that have taken place throughout London since the October 7th massacre. And so the Islamic Republic has an architecture and infrastructure in the UK that it uses to endanger Iranian dissidents and Israelis and the Jewish community. And while there have been robust law enforcement efforts to crack down on these issues, there has not been a policy response. There have been charity commission inquiries and all kinds of scrutiny from the UK Parliament, something that my colleague at UANI, Khosra Arabi, is intimately involved in. But there hasn't yet been a robust policy response. There's a law enforcement response, but we haven't been able to get to that place where not only in London, but Stockholm, elsewhere throughout Europe, we are closing and trying to crack down on these kinds of centers that are engaging in radicalization, extremism, propaganda in real time.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you all for being on this phenomenal panel.
Thank you to our panelists. Please join us now for a brief networking and coffee break. Gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. The program is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Welcome back. Our next panel, A Free Iran, Aligning America's Values and Interests, will argue why regime change in Iran benefits the United States. Joining us are Navid Mohebbi, an Iran analyst, Eli Kohanim, former U.S. Deputy Envoy to Combat Anti-Semitism, Walid Fares, author and scholar, and Michael Rubin, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Moderating is Taimaz Tumaj, NUFDI policy analyst.
Hello, how are all of you? I just want to say it's an absolute honor to be up here to moderate this distinguished panel. We're trying to keep it relatively conversational on this panel, so just keep that in mind. As Iranian Americans, this issue is inherently important to us, the alignment of the welfare of our two nations. But to understand the alignment of the interests of the United States and the interests of the Iranian people, we must understand our foe's common strategy. What is at the center of the regime's mutual strategy against the Iranian people and the United States? You can go ahead and start us off, Walid.
One, two. Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I would like to thank NUFDI's leadership for this invitation and say hello to all my friends, including on the panel. My 2 minutes or less are going to be about a very general description of what I believe is a strategic control by the Islamic regime in Iran, some would call it the Iranian regime, of our own strategies regarding that republic. Seems a little bit complicated, but here's the story. I have followed and analyzed the issue with the regime since February 11, 1979. I was a teenager. So I went through all these decades, during the Cold War, after the Cold War, after 9/11, after Iraq and Afghanistan, and of course after the Arab Spring, all the way till now. So my proposition is not about specifics. I could do this in the discussion. It's about it's at a historian level, if we want to say that. And my conclusion is that the regime is now winning over the decades. But they are winning because we are not winning. It makes it very oversimplified. We can win as a United States and international coalition. We have all the means. But the regime is winning because we are not taking the appropriate actions. We don't have the appropriate strategies to win that confrontation. The regime is not just in Iran, as we all know. It's Iraq, it's Syria, it's Lebanon, it's Yemen, and it's in the United States. The battle is happening mostly here. And one of the defaults, or one of the faults that we have as the United States is basically we are not able to read the strategic movements by what I call the Khomeinists in general terms. That's the most accurate, in my view, description of the regime. There are a lot of questions among our public and within the media and even within the intelligence community. I spent 15 years engaging with many agencies here, so I followed thoroughly what we call the Iran dossier. Most recently, since I do media a lot, we got all these questions from the anchors. What's happening in Yemen? They calculate, I was told, that Libya was done in 36 days. Saddam was done in 32 days. And on and on. Who are these Houthis that we cannot defeat if they are actually choking each other, closing the valve in the Red Sea, threatening international community? And on and on. Why are we not allowing Israel to finish the job with Hamas? Why are we not arming the Kurds as it should be to confront the militias coming from the regime. So all these questions seems to me that there is a lack of understanding of how the other camp is operating. And the problem, I don't think, is in the intelligence community. There are a lot of problems in the intelligence community, but they have all the capabilities that we don't have. They get the raw information. It's about policy. It's about the upper level, meaning the administration, not allowing these powerful arms, the powerful arms of the US government and of our allies. And here's the core of it. In my assessment, there is a force that emanated from the Islamic Republic years ago that has been able to land here in the United States that is blocking any strategic, serious action to trigger a change. We're not, they even impose the narrative. Oh, regime change, you cannot do regime change, and if it's not regime change, there's war, and we are against war, and then you have the whole peace movement, so on and so forth. They have been able to control several levels that paralyzes us on the inside. And everybody on the panels yesterday, we went to see this senator, we went to see this lawmaker or decision maker, and they seem not to be either not having a strategy or not willing to apply a strategy. Something is blocking us in America. Something is blocking the Iranian American and Middle Eastern American communities from getting to that spot. I mean, we are 45 years after the emergence of that regime. I call the problem, including in my latest book, the transaction. There is a transaction. We are all aware of it. We never ask really the questions, what is this transaction doing? 2015, actually 14, there were those negotiations between the Obama administration and our partners in Europe, China, Russia, and the regime. What was the most important point in that transaction or in that negotiation? Yes, we know the papers, we know the stipulations, so on and so forth. We've been playing up and down. It's the $150 billion. $150 billion that traveled either directly or in tranche to that regime. And when I'm making the statement I'm making, a third grader will figure this out. How are they spending? How did they spend the $150 billion? That's the core of the issue. Well, you don't need a political scientist to figure out. They spent it against us. First, they didn't irrigate their own economy. That's why we have panels here figuring out the economy of the future. Second, they spent it on oppressing the Iranian people, on feeding the militias around the region, and here's the most important weapon they had. It's not the drones, it's not the missiles. Some of the military experts here said these are the worst, they shot against Israel, failed. It doesn't matter. The real drones are here. They used billions of dollars to actually expand and influence in the West. What is protecting them is not their weapons. What is protecting them is that shield. The Israelis call it the Israeli dome. They have a dome here. And many among you and on these panels have, in segments, tried to investigate how this influence operates. It operates at all levels of government since 2015, interrupted for 4 years under the Trump administration, but not very successfully, because it was part also of the opposition against him in foreign policy. We tried everything we could to help the Iranians, the Iranian people, during even the Trump administration. There was an opposition from the bureaucracy. So where are these forces? First is academia. If you control the classroom is going to produce the newsroom. The newsroom will produce the art room, California's, Los Angeles, so on and so forth. So basically, that force that was deployed here is disqualifying us, is disabling us from taking the right decisions, strategic decisions. That's why we have those questions about today's politics. And let me conclude by saying, many among us ask, are they making mistakes? Is the administration making mistakes, or these decision makers are making mistakes? No. This is the policy. It's not they don't know how to do it. This is the policy. It's to protect the force they are sending those billions to, and I will invite you to think about it. When you send that amount of money, there is a money coming back, and that money coming back is influencing the decisions or no decisions or wrong decisions of our decision makers, and I can expand later. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Waleed. Our next question is going to be for Naveed. Under the Islamic Republic, Iran has been designated a state sponsor of terrorism, supporting groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. How would regime change in Iran impact the global fight against terrorism, and what benefits would it bring to both U.S. national security?
Thank you, Timas. First of all, I would like to thank NUFDI's leadership for organizing this amazing two-day conference. And as someone who has been here for the past 3 years, I think this third year is a huge progress from the past 2 years. So congratulations, Dr. Ganji and Mr. Razvan. To answer your question, Taimaz, I think it's pretty clear that the threats from the Islamic Republic regime is not hidden from anyone anymore. Iran's nuclear program, terrorism in the region, expansionism, they're all old news, and many of panelists over the past 2 days talked about that. But I think the problem is that over the past 10 years, 15 years, these issues are just getting bigger and more dangerous. No one could have imagined like 10 years ago that Iranian regime, Islamic Republic alongside Russia would become a huge problem for the integrity of election in the United States. Even worse, when you open TV and you watch news outlets, you are hearing every other day that the Iranian regime is plotting another assassination against former government officials or US candidates. So I think the real problem and what concerns me the most is our inaction and the fact that we have allowed this to happen and we are not doing anything about it. So I would say that this is a national security threat, and it's an internal threat. We are not taking the Islamic Republic regime threat seriously, and the issues are just getting bigger and bigger. I want to ask you this question. Do you remember if we had ever had any issues, for example, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, Iranian regime attempting to meddle in the US election? It's a new phenomenon. How about going after Iranian dissidents on US soil? Last time a terrorist group in 2001 attempted to successfully kill Americans, it didn't end up well. So why we are not acting against the Iranian regime? Iranian regime in nature, the Islamic Republic, is an expansionist force. They do not believe in the idea of a nation state. Khamenei just last week gave a speech stressing that he believes in and he's fully committed to the idea of Islamic Ummah, Ummat Islami, believing that all Islamic nations and Muslim countries should come under his control or the influence of the Iranian regime, or becoming another proxies for his agenda. So we have to take Khamenei's word seriously. That's why we are seeing that not only they are involved in Yemen, in Syria, in Gaza, in Iraq. They have so many militant groups and proxies, but they're also pushing further, going into Iraq, going to Jordan through the Syrian border, opening a new front against Israel. So the only thing that we are seeing is a bigger problem from the Iranian regime, bigger issue from the Iranian regime. And our policies over the past 15 years didn't work. That's why the Iranian regime is only advancing in the Middle East. They never had a loss. They are now controlling Yemen. They are now controlling Iraq. They are controlling Syria, Lebanon, and many other places. But now they are facing a real fighter named Israel, and we may see, and I'm hopeful that we will see the first Iranian regime loss in the region, and that's the elimination of Hamas. A total and complete regime change in Gaza. It would be our first win against the Iranian regime. They have been able to hold on to their grip on power in so many other parts of the world. So I'm very hopeful that Israel will be able to get our first win against the regime. And my suggestion for the state of Israel is that just look at these proxy groups' manifest. They are dedicated in eliminating the state of Israel. You cannot coexist with group. Don't wait until they knock on your door. You have to go against them preemptively. So to answer your, the second part of your question about what would a free Iran, be posing benefits for United States, I think in addition to the fact that all these issues that I just mentioned will be gone, and I don't even want to mention the fact that Iran will be an energy hub in the region and in the world. Iran has one of the biggest gas reserves in the world, and before the revolution, our oil production was 6.5 million, much more than what Iraq is producing now. So Europe can be totally independent from Russia, and Iran will have much to offer to the region. And also, we have seen the rise of isolationism in the United States, and we are hearing from both parties that we want our troops back home. Guess what? In 1970s, United States was not in Bahrain, in Qatar, in Kuwait. And so we can get back to the golden era of US-Iran relationship, which was during President Nixon and our late Shah, and the policy of two pillars. Iran will be the guarantor of peace and stability in the region. That's, I think, what can a free Iran can offer to the world.
Thank you, Naveed. There's some great points. Our next question is going to be for Ellie. The regime's human rights abuses have drawn international condemnation. How would regime change improve the human rights situation in Iran, and how do U.S. interests align with the people of Iran?
First of all, I just want to say good morning to everybody, and thank you to Dr. Ganji, to Kamran Khansarinia and NUFDI for inviting me and for hosting these fabulous 2 days. I think we've had some really important conversations. I want to answer your question, Taimaz, by kind of saying how much I agree, Naveed, with your indignation at perhaps the lack of action as we see the Islamic Republic of Iran's regime increase aggression on a daily basis. And so the question is, would human rights be improved under a free Iran under regime change? And I think that goes without saying. We know that the Islamic Republic is one of the world's worst human rights abusers. All of the human rights organizations have documented this ad nauseum. And so the question, though, that I'd like to focus on is the U.S. interests. And does the U.S. interests align with the Iranian people's interests? And I would argue that that is 100% the case. The Iranian people are daily oppressed and under threat from this regime, and we are also, as the United States, dealing with a significant threat from the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so to just kind of lay that out a little bit, if you zoom out and you look at the global stage right now, and I've described a lot of this in a chapter that I just recently published for the America First Policy Institute. And in the chapter I describe what is happening on the global stage, which is that we are seeing this strengthening alliance between China, Russia, and Iran. And this is happening as China hopes to really remove the United States as a global superpower and really compete with the US, and if not replace the US, and create this multipolar world as they see it, with Russia as a partner in this. And so Iran is playing a significant role in trying to create this new multipolar world that, that they are looking to create. And so the US is being directly threatened by this axis of evil. And so this is what's happening. So they are conducting everything from joint military exercises together. They are working together hand in glove to evade sanctions together. And they're creating supply chains with each other. We are hearing, of course, about how Iran is supplying Russia right now with UAVs, drones, missiles, and in return we are hearing worrying reports that perhaps Russia might be helping Iran with its nuclear program and giving Iran capabilities that it doesn't currently have. So this is a serious threat and a new, unique challenge to the United States that we have not faced yet in our history. Now, if we had only this access to deal with, it would be enough for the United States to understand the seriousness of the Iranian regime's threat to the US. But it's not only that, it's also the direct threat. Let's remember that this regime came from the original sin of taking the US embassy personnel hostage. That is how this regime came to be in its earliest days. They have murdered countless American citizens and military personnel. Only since October 7th, they have attacked US assets over 75 times. And the list goes on. Today we know that the Iran-backed Houthis are causing unprecedented disruption in the commercial and military naval freedom of movement. The United States is considered the international police officer of the seas. And so all of this is going on. This is on a daily basis. And then we heard what Navid was describing just now, which is, again, historically unprecedented. Our intelligence agencies are saying that the Islamic Republic of Iran is actively trying to assassinate former President Trump, as he's also running for president of the United States again, on American soil. The level of nerve that it takes for the Islamic Republic to be actively trying to assassinate a former US president. They are also interfering with our elections right now, again, unprecedented, to the extent that they have hacked the Trump campaign and tried to give that information over to the Harris campaign. So when you look at this picture, it is abundantly clear that the Islamic Republic of Iran is posing an unprecedented threat to the United States. And the question just becomes, how do we as a country respond to this threat? We've seen from the Democrat Party, Jimmy Carter, who helped usher in the Islamic Republic regime, and from Barack Obama to Joe Biden, where there's been a policy of appeasement. And I think we all understand that this appeasement policy does not work. So clearly under President Trump, we had the maximum pressure campaign, and that was spoken about a bit yesterday. We saw the elimination of Qasem Soleimani. This was clearly a new front in US policy in how to deal with the threat of the Islamic Republic. And I have no doubt that should we see President Trump back in office in January, we are going to see a new policy towards Iran that will be radically different from what we are unfortunately experiencing right now.
Thank you, Ellie. Our next question is going to be an open question, so whoever wants to answer it, if you guys all want to give an answer. Iran's influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen has contributed to regional instability. How could a change in Iran's government alter the balance of power in the Middle East, and what are the potential benefits for regional allies?
Michael, you want to?
No, don't worry, I'm going to chime in, but this is for you or Waleed, I think.
I'll follow up. No, go ahead.
So you want to speak about the proxies?
Correct, yeah.
So, I mean, you know, the proxies are, what I have found frustrating is the lack of understanding of the proxies as proxies, right? So when the international community looks at Hamas and perceives Hamas as a terror group in Gaza, and the Houthis as a terror group in Yemen that's, you know, so let's say Hamas is threatening the Israelis, and the Houthis are threatening the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, and the Bahrainis, and then they look at Hezbollah as a separate, you know, terror entity, and that's also perhaps threatening Israel, and so on. They go through the proxies and look at them as individual problems and treat them as individual problems. Well, I would argue that these, you know, it's a failed strategy. It's a failed strategy, and it's really it's overdue for the international community, including the United States, including the Israelis, to understand that this is going to be an endless cycle of violence, and you can continue to constantly try to deal with the symptom, which are the proxies, or you can just go to the head of the octopus, as a lot of people are calling it, and go to where the problem emanates from, and that is the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Let me add a couple points.
I think Michael wanted to go, and then we'll come to you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. Actually, I was going to pay you a compliment, Waleed, on this, but in addressing this question, first of all, of course, thank you to NUFDI, thank you to Dr. Ganji. I don't want to be the only person on the panel, be ta'aruf. So with that, what I would say, if we want to look at this in the context of Waleed's opening comments, I think that the United States has two problems as we approach this region that allows us to confuse ourselves about our own values. The first problem is that we conceive of history in snippets of maybe 2 or 4 years. We don't have a broad sense, and therefore, just like during the Arab Spring, which caught many people by surprise, suddenly academics were commissioned to write books, and they wrote books about the Arab Spring saying, we always saw it coming, how come you didn't see it coming? It was the natural apex of all the political evolution. The same thing happened in 1979 when you had books commissioned, and we all know the authors who wrote these, Nikki Keddie, Ervand Abrahamian, and so forth, whose main theses were this Islamic Republic was the natural political evolution. It was the apex of that political evolution. They don't understand that the Islamic Revolution, the Islamic Republic, is an anomaly, not the norm, and that it's overdue for a hard landing, if I may use the regime's own parlance. Now, the point of this when it comes to the proxies is that, and this goes to the second issue, the United States doesn't understand ideology. It can be very comforting to look at terrorism through the lens of grievance, because if the problem that we have with Hezbollah, with Hamas, with the Houthis is grievance, then you can come up with some magic diplomatic formula to make it go away. The problem is, it's not grievance related. It is ideology, pure and simple. Then the question comes, lack of imagination. How often have we heard, Hezbollah is a fact of life. Hamas is a fact of life. There's no way to get rid of them. Can you defeat an ideology? Well, if you think in greater sense of history than 2 years, how worried are we today about the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany? Or if territory is the issue, thank God that back in the 1970s we didn't say we just have to live with the Khmer Rouge. The fact of the matter is you can uproot these ideologies, and I suspect, in answer to your specific question, that when the Islamic Republic falls, that we are going to see these other proxies, which are the tentacles of the octopus, have a very hard landing indeed, because their ideology is now completely delegitimized in the eyes of the people, And I'm sure Waleed has seen this. I have my friends in Lebanon and so forth. I spend a lot of time in Dakhliya and in southern Lebanon, and people are openly mocking Hezbollah today. And this is just going to come, it's a phenomenon which is going to steamroll it. If, and I defer to Eli in this, and to Naveed, if the United States doesn't snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, we shouldn't get in the way of the Iranian people and in people more broadly throughout the region putting an end to this odious, odious regime.
Since we started the description now, I can see the US now under this administration and the Obama administration as a huge turtle nobody can defeat directly. And the regime as a hyena is much faster. What we lack now is a lack of speed, but we don't have the speed because we don't have the strategy. We don't have the strategy because the policy is going into another direction. This administration, I would not fault only the administration, the intelligentsia behind this administration, do not look at what they call the Iranian government, which in fact is the Islamic regime, as a foe, as an enemy, even when their agencies are telling them they are trying to kill a former president. Even if their agencies, and correct me, Michael, because you worked on Iraq, tells us that more than 700 US military have been killed in Iraq by militias taking orders from the Khomeini regime. We are at a very bad situation. And I said earlier, it's going to take the next administration a long time before cleaning up not just the bureaucracies from the bad apples, but cleaning up the way we think about the region and getting to academia and then getting to media, give them the actual right analysis. And to answer this question, Michael is right. Let me say what he was right about. The societies, civil societies in the Middle East are ripe and ready. Who's going to convince me that the Iranian people is not ready for a massive change? That's why the demands of the Iranian people are massive support, maximum support. The problem is those who are blocking that change are us. You ask anybody in the Middle East, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, what is happening? Why are we not being successful? And the answer is not only the United States is neutral. If it was neutral, in some places, local societies can win if they were not neutral. But to come in June of 2009, have the President of the United States assuring and reassuring the regime in public that we are not going to meddle in this. This is not, because we're going to be seen as meddling in Iranian affairs. What does that mean in regional politics? Go ahead, take them. I'm not going to intervene. The first policy you have when you have a struggle between a society, unarmed society, and an oppressive regime like the Khomeinis, it's like what Reagan, when Reagan says, Mr. Gorbachev, bring down that wall, destroy the wall. Unfortunately, it's going to take, and it's the first time I say it in terms of analyzing the region, it's going to take an election here. It's going to take a change beyond the election to rectify, to change our perception of the Middle East. And I am confident, like most of us on this panel, that the Middle East today, the peoples, including, and I would start with the Iranian people, but every other colonies and vassal state to that regime, already it's going to look like somehow like when the Soviet Union collapsed. Every single domino collapsed. So helping the Iranian people to free themselves from this regime is going to help the entire region and therefore the world. So I'm with you on the necessity of a change, massive change.
I couldn't agree more with you. One of the issues that we are facing right now is that the presidents or some elements in the US government are not even interested in solving the Iranian regime's threats. I think the administration approach is like, get Iran off of my agenda. I don't want to deal with Iran. So we are facing with a status quo. What is the status quo? The United States is telling the Iranian regime, do not enrich uranium any further we are not going to enforce sanctions. That's why we are seeing unprecedented amount of oil sale by the Iranian regime. And so who is benefiting from the status quo? The Iranian regime itself, because they are making billions of dollars and they're using that money to support their proxies. Now we are seeing that one of their proxies, Houthis in Yemen, who used to live in the back of the mountains in north of Yemen, they have the kind of ballistic missiles that even many Arab countries don't have. Hezbollah has the kind of arsenal that many Arab countries don't have. So it's an issue. So if you ask me how we can solve these issues altogether, first of all, I'm not a military expert, so I can't say or advocate for a military intervention against the regime. I can talk about the kind of things that I know about, and that's empowering the Iranian people against the Islamic Republic regime in Iran. Do Iranian people have the kind of commitment that the West needs to see first? Yes. Over the past 6 years, actually since 2017, more than 3,000 Iranians have lost their lives. So no one can say that, oh, the idea of regime change or collapsing, helping to bring down the Iranian regime is just a diaspora thing. They have been, overseas for 45 years. They're out of touch with the Iranian people. No, that's not the case. People on the ground are fighting and they are demanding help from the Western countries. So what should be the strategy in order to bring down the regime and help the Iranian people? I suggest or advise Western countries and Israel just to copy-paste what the Iranian regime is doing in respect to its proxies. They are providing funding, they are providing intelligence supports, military supports. Nothing is off the table for them. If the Western countries, Israel, show the same kind of commitment and dedication that the Iranian regime is showing to its proxies, to the Iranian people, we are going to see change in Iran. I was reading a report, I think it was by FDD in 2020, that the Iranian regime is spending around $7 billion to $15 billion per year supporting its groups, supporting its proxies in the region. Regime change and empowering Iranian people is expensive. Who's going to pay for all that? So as Iran, Russia, China, they are collaborating with one another, the new axis of evil, the Western countries, democracies, Israel, and Arab nations should also unite against their common enemy, the Iranian regime, and help and support Iranian opposition. We are talking about maximum support, providing maximum support to Iran, but that's expensive. Providing internet to Iranians is going to cost money. Providing a strike fund for the Iranian workers is going to strike money. And believe me, we cannot raise that kind of fund from the diaspora overseas. We need support, funding, and the same level of commitment that Iranian regime's proxies have from the Iranian regime. If we don't show the same level of commitment, if we don't match the level of funding that the regime provides, actually it has to be 3 times more. Do you know why? Because Arab countries, United States, Western countries are way richer than Iranian regime. I don't see that level of commitment from those countries. Israel just waited until it's encircled by the Iranian regime. I think now, after what happened in October 7, they're understanding that regime change and empowering the Iranian people is the option. But we need international support. Regime change is not like pushing a button or participating in conferences or talking about it. It has to get into implementation phase, and that has to start from empowering Iranian people and its rightful opposition. We need to have funding resources. I guarantee you, many Iranian groups are so broke that they can't even rent such a place for their events. How can you fight off the Iranian regime that it's a security state and all its resources are spent in protecting and preserving its agenda? It's impossible. Hezbollah is receiving $1 billion per year. And one of our best organizations here, such as NUFDI, is much smaller. So that has to be supported by Iranian people, organizations like NUFDI, by Iranian diaspora, and also our allies. Our community is very fractured. They are traumatized after 45 years. So we need kind of support. But NUFDI is different from the opposition groups. That has to come from other countries, actually. I don't see that level of commitment.
If I can jump in on that. You know, countering the Iranian threat is far more expensive than investing in the Iranian opposition. And you know, when we talk about aligning America's values with the values and interests of the Iranian people, so we've seen over and over again that the Iranian people have taken bullets to the head because they are seeking freedom from this regime. And you know, I don't even like to use the language they, because I myself was born in Iran to a very proud Jewish family, and we trace our ancestry back to ancient Persia over 2,000 years, you know, predating the Islamic conquest of Persia. And so I don't even like to use the language they, it's really we, right? We, the Iranian people, whether it's those who are still in Iran, have taken bullets to the head in their quest for freedom. And those of us who have been forced out of our ancient homes in the diaspora are daily fighting for the freedom of our brothers and sisters still there and for our own homeland. And so in terms of the United States and the US values, well, the United States is premised on Judeo-Christian values. It's the notion that the human being is created in the image of God, that every human life has worth and value, and that the Iranian people deserve the human rights that we enjoy here in the West. Every year, the U.S. State Department issues the human rights reports, and they are cataloging the abuses that this regime is committing against its own people. So we're confident, and we know that the interests of this country aligns with the interests of the people of Iran. And again, Navid, it costs so much less for us to invest in the Iranian people than to try to counter the threat of the Islamic Republic. In my AFPI chapter, I outline, and we've heard a lot of discussion here in this conference, about a new American policy that would be a continuation of the Trump policy, which is maximum pressure, but adding to that, maximum pressure on the Islamic Republic regime, but adding to it maximum support for the Iranian people. And so what that would look like, well, it would be more engagement of opposition groups. It would be helping to build civil society. And I think perhaps most importantly, it would be beginning to think about strategic planning for a day after the fall of the Islamic Republic. Because what you and I in this room know is that this regime is an anomaly. They do not represent the proud thousands-year-old ancient Persian history. They are a 45-year anomaly. They are going to be in the ash heap of autocracies, and like the Nazis before them, we're going to see them in the ash heap of history. And truly like the Nazis before them, what we are going to see following this fall of this regime will be a de-radicalization program. And just as we defeated the Nazis, Michael, to your point about do you defeat an ideology? Yes, we defeated the Nazi ideology, and we will be able to defeat the Islamic Republic of Iran's ideology, which has poisoned the entire Middle East, North Africa. And so, you know, I am confident that with the right people in the White House in the United States, we will see unprecedented support for the Iranian people, because now we are suddenly in an unprecedented time.
I'm going to,
sorry. Can I jump?
I'm going to jump in very quickly. Of course, I agree with what Ellie said, but I also want to pick up on Waleed's question about the hundreds of Americans who were killed in Iraq because of Iran. One of the broader patterns which we need to recognize, and this goes to the heart of America's values, is that when the United States across administrations approaches Iran, too often we approach it with a polite, almost racist disdain, in that we're not holding the Iranians to the same standards. I'm talking about the Iranians in the Islamic Republic that we hold the rest of the world to. We need to recognize that the Iranians, the Islamic Republic, has agency. They are behind their own decisions and have to be held accountable for them. A few years ago, and this goes into Waleed's question, hundreds of Americans were killed, but how often have we heard, can we really pin this on the Islamic Republic? It could have been rogue actors. A few years ago for the National Counterterrorism Center, I went through the list of rogue actions that American diplomats, European diplomats dismissed. We could go back to the Qassemloo affair on July 13th, 1989. We just passed the anniversary of the Mykonos Cafe assassinations. You had the Buenos Aires bombings in 1992 and the Jewish Cultural Center in 1994. We could go all the way up to Iraq with the improvised explosive devices. When you look at each of those cases, one thing is, there's two items in common. The first is the actual terrorism was dismissed as a rogue action. The second item is the perpetrator was promoted after the fact. And so that is proof itself that the Iranians are simply taking advantage of our naivete. They're treating us like a country of useful idiots, as they have their own very specific, very precise strategy. We need to recognize that the Islamic Republic is not passive. They're very proactive. And it's not them who are not in control of their own actions. It is us who are being taken for fools. So the first thing we need to do is actually recognize when we look at our adversary, that our adversary is working directly and with precision to defeat us. And we need to conceptualize that so that we, as Elias said, as Navita said, as Waleed have said, we need a strategy to defeat the Islamic Republic. And look, this isn't the topic of the panel, but I would argue that what needs to be first and foremost on the agenda of the next administration isn't simply the maximum pressure, which is wise and necessary. It's figuring out how to fracture the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Because until we reach that step, it's simply wishful thinking to believe that our enemies aren't going to take action against us.
Thank you. Michael, I mean, the three of you have covered most of my answers, but let's do some work of imagination. Ellie spoke about the D-Day, the day after, the D-Day and the day after. Let me try a projection of events that should happen for our policy to change, symbolically strong changes of perception. Number one, an American president should address the Iranian people with a speech on TV, translated in the languages, Farsi and others in Iran. People inside Iran needs to see an American president addressing them to reverse a speech that was delivered by another American president in Cairo, where he declared an alliance with the jihadists. That has to change completely. Second, the people inside Iran should see that the next White House will open the Oval Office to a delegation of leadership of the opposition. Inside Iran needs to see that their voice is outside, that all the problems of ignoring the opposition, not speaking with the opposition, this has to be resolved. I mean, imagine families of hostages, American hostages in Iran, or Iranian, let's say, activists who are in prison. They need to hear a voice, and that should be the voice of the next President of the United States. Then, obviously, the good stuff. The good stuff is, before dropping any dollar anywhere, stop sending billions of dollars to the regime. That's the minimum for a change of policy. And I would agree that was a policy of the Bush administration to allocate, was it about $50 million, 70 million, to double and triple that amount and send it to the opposition, starting by the diaspora. We, as friends of Iran, a free Iran, will pressure the next administration. They won't need pressure because that's what they envisage to do, but we need to talk to Congress that we need to support them. I mean, you have paid trillions of dollars in Afghanistan, billions and billions on various armies. We're talking to you about a civil society in the diaspora that itself is supporting the people of Iran. We as Americans, and you as Iranian Americans, should be telling our federal government that we need to support this opposition. And last point, the real actual menace that is putting their weight on the administration, on Congress, on everything, are economic interests in this country, and in France, and in Germany, etc. That is something that we don't discuss much. And those economic interests were promised by the Iran deal, and of course by the smart ayatollahs behind them. Oh, if you protect us, if you stop any action against us, we are going to behave well. We don't like Al-Qaeda. They start selling us, mercantile stuff. We need to talk to these financial interests. You need, as communities, Congress needs, and hopefully if there is another administration in that line, call on these companies. Yes, we know you have those contracts since the Obama time, like, I don't want to name them now, but I will name them later. 5, 6 gigantic companies that are placing their weight on the Oval Office, because the Oval Office may not know anything about what's going on. They just look at the National Security Advisor advice and then go with it. Those companies need to understand not only what you're doing is immoral, not only what you're doing, it is counterproductive. I mean, you are so happy with the $150 billion, and the return is $15 billion. Every broker knows that. When you send $150 billion to someone, to a party, you're going to get 10%. So all that lobbying and all that catastrophic pressure on all decision makers is the weight of $15 billion. So what we need to tell them is that $150 billion, if you work with the Iranian economy yesterday, what did we hear on this panel? It's $5 to $7 trillion. Even as business people, you're making very wrong business decisions. So let go of your pressure. Let go of the Iran deal. Support the Iranian opposition. Free Iran and let the world thrive in peace. That would be my recommendation for the next administration. Thank you.
And then I think we only have time for one more question. It's going to be open-ended, though, so you can all take a jab at it. Lessons from other regime change efforts, such as in Iraq and Libya, highlight the challenges and risks involved. How can the U.S. ensure that a strategy for regime change in Iran doesn't end up the same way?
So I have a lot of friends in the former Trump administration who were, involved or were on the ground in Iraq. And I think that part of the challenge we have in the United States in imagining a new and stronger policy towards Iran is the trauma, if I may use that word, of the American experience and what happened in Iraq. So that's the bad news, but then there's the good news. The good news is that we went through that. I think there were lessons learned. There are a lot of really smart people like Joel Rayburn and others who can catalog how do we avoid the pitfalls and mistakes. But I'm also gonna say something that may be slightly controversial, which is that in order for us to get to a free Iran and a democratic and secular Iran, which I would imagine is what the Iranian people want, we have to believe, though, that we will need at some point a caretaker government, and we're going to need trusted individuals to be responsible and to be partners to the United States. And there was one person who spoke here yesterday who both the US government knows, the international community knows, but most importantly, the people of Iran know. And that is the Iranian Crown Prince. And so, sure. I think one of the lessons to be learned from Iraq, from Afghanistan, is that we need a trusted caretaker government that will help us get through to a transition. And then after a transition, certainly there should be democratic elections in Iran, and let the Iranian people decide their fate from there.
Yeah. To answer your question, Taimaz, United States can only blame itself and its decision-making for what happened in Iraq. Why is that? They spent billions of dollars in Iraq, liberated the country, and then they handed the country to the Islamic Republic regime in Iran. They should have not done that. And their idea was that, oh, we're going to liberate the country, and then we're going to have an election. But if you play by the rules, your enemies do not play by the rules. We have election in Iraq, but with the presence of so many Iranian proxies and militant groups and the economic leverage that they have against the Iraqi societies, those elections are not free. So United States should have leverage its troops on the ground against groups that do not play by the rules and not involve them in the process. They should have oppressed them. And the U.S. policy should be having a reliable ally on those countries rather than having an open-ended election that your enemies do not play by the rules. And in 2011, United States government should not have pulled out troops from Iraq. They could have used it as leverage against Qasem Soleimani and his thugs and Sadd's movement. They should have oppressed them. But the issue is that they spent the money and then they lost their interest. They left the country. It created a vacuum, and the Iranian regime took over. But for this time around, for Iran, we don't need troops on the ground. We need a reliable ally who has a proven track record and is seeking friendship with the state of Israel, with the United States and other countries.
I'm going to jump in with a different example, and we can debate Iraq all day, but I spent much of January, some of you know, in Cuba. And when it comes to Cuba, there is a popular misconception, especially among the Cubans, that Barack Obama had lifted sanctions, then Donald Trump had reimposed sanctions. There was frustration that Joe Biden hadn't lifted some of the restrictions on cigars and rum. But the fact of the matter is that Barack Obama didn't lift sanctions on Cuba. He massaged things around the edge in interpretations. But the reason he didn't lift sanctions is because most of the sanctions in Cuba were legislated, and it would take an act of Congress to undo them. So when it comes to the Iranian case, to what the regime fears most are those movements which transcend ethnicity, transcend social class, and transcend region. And so this is why they crack down so much on the woman life freedom movement, or on labor unions, or on environmental protesters. So the question then becomes, what can we legislate in a way that no president can undo, that says that the United States is committed to independent trade unions in Iran, and we will fund them in this regard? What can we do to say that the United States stands for clean, green, environmental policies everywhere in the world, including Iran, and this is what we're going to do to support the environmental movement or the women life freedom movement and their allies? That can't simply be, I mean, we're in a period of ping-pong, whiplash diplomacy among administrations. We can wish it away, but that's the fact of life. So therefore, if we want to learn the lesson, and this is a lesson which is now successful in Cuba, because freedom isn't going to be denied to the people by rewarding the military regime there. What we need to do is legislate, legislate, legislate in a way that takes away the options for whoever is in the White House to implement their worst instincts.
But we have enough legislations against the Iranian regime. Sanctions are in place. The issue is that they're not being implemented.
No, the difference is that there's a difference between sanctions and sanctions without waivers. There's a difference between how you do the sanctions, and something like the Helms-Burton law, which was deliberately passed to deny any future administration the power to unravel those sanctions with an executive order as opposed to an act of Congress.
You know, one thing that perhaps the next Senate can do is that we're going to put every single nominees on hold until you implement oil sanctions against the Iranian regime. We are going to do obstruction until you take action.
Can I follow up on this point and then give an example from 2019, the end of the Trump administration? Number one, there are many politicians in this city who are divided on what to do with Iran and with its regime. Of course, those who support the Iran regime, the Iran deal, they say, don't do anything, don't engage, don't unnerve the Ayatollahs, and we have all these problems around the region. On the other side, there are also some problematic positions. For example, the one I hear from good friends in the Senate, we're going to go and bomb the infrastructure of Iran. Maybe the regime will think twice. Why do we want to bomb the infrastructure of Iran? We have the Pasdaran, we have the Sepa Pasdaran, we have all the guards that guards the regime. If there are demonstrations, if there are masses, if there are reactions against the masses, what you do is a speech from the White House and you degrade the capacity of these militias. These militias already are engaged against Israel, already are engaged against our forces in Iraq and Syria. But let me give you the example of what could have been a different time. 2019, I was working unofficially with Brian Hook, Ambassador Brian Hook from the State Department, and he had a great team. They created an international coalition of countries, international coalition, and guess where was the actual headquarters of that coalition? In Warsaw. I don't know if anybody was there. It was an international coalition to isolate the regime, to apply all the program that I have been speaking about. That was a Trump policy. And actually, it was about to start. The lists were about to contact, the list of opposition leaders, including the national leaders, to bring them to the White House. But then what happened? The revolution in Iran, in Lebanon, in Iraq in 2019, they had to adapt the policy. And then COVID hit. And then the rest is history as you know it, because that administration ceased from existing. So there were examples where policies like this, strategic policies, can come back and be better for the next 4 years, maybe for the next 8 years. So I have great hope that if we do a change in general in our policy. I even went on TV and said, even with the last 40 days of the Biden administration, before any other administration comes, they have some sort of epiphany and they change their policy, I'll support them. But it's not going to happen, obviously. We need another administration. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we do have time for one audience question for Dr. Rubin. The question says, groups like the MEK spend millions of dollars to buy off politicians. What can groups like NUFDI do to compete and stay ahead with vastly less financial resources?
Look, we're out of time, and I see lunch is being served, so let me just say this, that reputational damage to politicians can matter just as much as donations. And I see this on the broad level when it comes to international businesses that are considering doing business with the regime in Iran. And the response isn't to try to beat the Mujahideen al-Khalq at their own corrupt game. It's to basically have moral clarity and ensure that the politicians understand that if they take any of this blood money, that they are going to be held accountable and they are going to be publicly embarrassed.
Thank you so much, guys. I'm sure we could continue this conversation for another several hours, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you.
Thank you to our esteemed panelists.
Thank you.
Please welcome back to the stage NUFDI Vice President Kamran Khansarinia for closing remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us over the past 2 days for the third annual Iran conference. As I've said now several times, each and every one of our speakers who took time out of their busy days as senior officials, as former senior officials, as leaders at the most important academic and think tank institutions in the United States, each and every single one of them did it without receiving a single cent. They did it because they're standing on the right side of history. They do it because they're telling the truth. They're doing it because they support the people of Iran and because they support U.S. national security interests. And that's exactly what we stand for at this conference. I want to take just one moment to reiterate NUFDI's sincere thanks to our speakers, the nearly 35 of them over the past 2 days who took time out of their schedules to join us. I want to thank the incredible NUFDI team and volunteers who have spent the past 2 days and really the past 2 months preparing for this event. For those watching and for those who have attended this conference, it may shock you to know that NUFDI's full-time team is only 7 people. And I say this not just because I have the pleasure of working with these great folks, but for an organization in Washington, D.C. to be able to put on a conference like this with a team of only 7 full-time employees is remarkable. One of our dear guests today, non-Iranian, came up to me and asked what the NUFDI budget was. And I told him, and it was, a bit sad because it should be much more. And he said, you guys are the biggest bang for your buck organization in Washington, D.C. And because of the support of people like you, who, with your financial contributions and your investment in NUFDI and investment in this cause, we can continue to move forward. We can continue to host events like this. We can continue to ensure that the Iranian American community and the Iranian people's voice, as the Crown Prince said yesterday in his keynote address, is finally heard in Washington, D.C. And it's our honor and our privilege to do this work, but we can't do it without you. If you don't support NUFDI financially, maybe amongst Iranians it's not easy or not pleasant to talk about money, but if you aren't willing to chip in $100, $50, $20 a month to support this work, then NUFDI will close its doors, and there will be no voice for our community in Washington, D.C. Because unlike some organizations, we will never sell out to a foreign government. We will never sell out to big moneyed interests. And our work that I think is important, and I hope that you do too, is only possible with your continued financial support. So I hope that you'll consider it. And as an extra urging to do that, I have some good news to share with you at the end of this conference, and many of you on your phones may have seen this, that it appears that an airstrike has been carried out in Beirut, and it's possible that Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, is dead. And we hope that, of course, no innocent Lebanese civilians were killed. We pray for the people of Lebanon. We pray that the people of Lebanon find peace and are able to find salvation from Hezbollah, just like the people of Iran are able to find salvation from the Islamic Republic. So join us again next year. Stay up to date with NUFDI. Thank you for joining us.